Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Hi, welcome. Today I'm talking with Brian Niemeier. I assume you're best known as the author of the Soul Cycle series?
That would probably be correct, yes.
Although fairly big now, very recently is, and I haven't gotten enough sleep, so the name of it is escaping me, but you have a short story in a collection of short stories that just came out, don't you?
Yes, I do. The anthology is called Forbidden Thoughts. It has several authors in it that would be known to those who followed the sad and rabid puppies saga over the Hugos for the last couple of years, including Larry Correia, Brad Torgerson, Sarah Hoyt, and Vox Day, as well as John C. Wright and his lovely and talented wife, and my editor, LG Lamplighter Wright. My story is called LG for the Locust, and you're correct that I would still be best known as the author of the Soul Cycle because that story ties into the Soul Cycle. But
So,
the reason, well, I was going to say the reason that Forbidden Thoughts might eclipse my fame as the author of the Soul Cycle series is an introduction by Milo Yiannopoulos.
yeah, both the perils and the benefits of being near bright stars, I suppose. I mean stars in the. I was using that in the astronomical sense, but as thinking of the metaphor, that if you're near a bright star, it's very easy to locate, and consequently, you can be found by it. But star also means more commonly other things. Anyway, so could you give just a very brief? It's horror is the genre. Can you give a brief description of the Soul Cycle series?
Certainly, and horror is only one genre box that you could put the series into. I adhere to Larry Correia's advice to just write what you like and then let Amazon and the other bookstores worry about how to pigeonhole it. So it's really the epitome of genre bashing, or as it's been called, the kitchen sink book. I believe Jeffro Johnson from Castle House blog called it that. So there are sci-fi elements, there are fantasy elements, there are urban fantasy elements, and yes, of course, in every book there is a horror element, but it's a different kind of horror in each book, really.
Interesting. Now, as I understand it, your background actually, you had studied theology at a Franciscan university.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct. Franciscan University of Steubenville.
So how did you end up? Because at the moment, you're actually supporting yourself professionally by your writing. Is that correct?
That is correct. Which takes a lot of brand building, a lot of marketing, and a lot of ramen.
So how did you end up? So I assume writing has been a passion of yours for a long time. How did you end up making that transition? And at what point did it seem realistic to actually go for it?
I ended up not actually having a choice. I have to do this. And much like the star metaphor, there are two senses in which that's true. One is because it turns out I do have a God-given talent for the written word. I feel bad if I don't write. It's just something I'm impelled and inspired to do. So again, don't want to hide my light under a bushel basket. I want to use the gifts that God gave me to glorify him and to entertain others. On a very pragmatic level, I tried working in the private sector and they wouldn't have me, so I have to do this now.
It's funny. Actually, it's something. Talking to people, encountered a few people saying, well, how can I figure out what's the work that God's given me to do? And of course, one answer is, well, look at the work that you've been handed. That may well be it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So there's when people ask something of you, well, maybe giving it to them is the work you've been given to do. And it does seem, I've followed your blog for a bit now, a month or two, I think. And it does seem you take the idea of entertaining your fans very seriously.
Oh, deadly seriously, because it's It's a matter of my livelihood. It is a matter of life and death. And as an artist, I see it as my duty to serve truth. And that means serving my patrons in charity.
Hmm.
So I'm not going to lie to them. I'm not going to abuse them. I'm not going to pull a fast one on them. They're my bosses. I'm beholden to them.
No, it was. I don't know if you happen to catch the interview I did with Russell Newquist, but a topic that came up in our conversation was that actually of patronage. It's something I find very interesting about the modern era is we're kind of returning to an era of patronage, distributed patronage made possible by technology, but nonetheless, I think you can see it in a lot of different places. That like Patreon being one, and somewhat obviously named, but that in the medieval period, especially, you had very much a system of patronage, and it served a very useful role. So we had spoken about this, that you need not just talent to make good art, but also good taste, and that those two skills being united in one person are less common than just one of them. And so in the patronage system, you can take somebody who's got the talent and select for that, and then the patron, who's very often just a very ordinary average person, would impose something of the a common sort of taste onto the artist. And so I'm. Do you see that? I'm okay. In what sense do you see your fans in that sort of patron sense, even though you are still using the sort of conventional model of making it first and then people buy it afterwards? And what do you think of the patron, to the degree that we're going for a modern patronage system, and what do you think of patronage systems?
Well, I'll go ahead and defer to a much more prominent and frankly better writer than I, Neil Stevenson. And he once said in an interview that there are two kinds of artists. There are what he called Beowulf artists, and then I believe what he called Da Vinci artists. So there are those who do have patrons to please, and like I said, do tend to have others' tastes imposed on them, sort of making it work for hire. And then there are those who say, well, I'm just going to tell a story to tell a story. And I don't necessarily have any more strictures placed on me than the tradition I'm working in, but I might not make a living at it because we don't know if Homer made a living from reciting epic poetry or the unknown authors of Beowulf. And what he was speaking about more in terms of patronage was those literary writers who might have a day job as an English professor or teaching a Master of Fine Arts program, and then will write a book or two a year to get published through the university press, or a short story in a very exclusive literary journal. He illustrated this point with a story about how he was at a major convention, like either Worldcon or Gen Con, somewhere of the sort. And he fell into speaking with a nice young lady who also identified herself as a writer. And they started talking. It was clear that she didn't know who he was. And he didn't want to embarrass her, so he just, he humored her. Until finally she asked him, okay, so what do you do for a living? And he said, oh, I'm a writer. So she said, oh, okay, well, I mean, like, what is your full-time job? He said, well, I'm a writer. So she's like, oh, well, then what? Do you have like an endowment or a grant or something? Or are you like a tenure chair somewhere? And he's like, no, I'm a writer. And then her face fell. Her eyes just widened like a deer in headlights. And he thought, oh no, she's thinking, he's one of them. He's one of those lowbrows who writes popular fiction. So I think that might be the older sense of patronage that might give it a bad name. What I'm more think of it as is, like you said, people with Patreon accounts, or another concept that my friend Jeff Dunton, another fantastic author, talks about is micro celebrity, where nowadays, thanks to innovations like Kindle Direct Publishing and Patreon and blogs with tip jars, you don't really need 6 million fans. You just need 1,000. And if you're going to you can cultivate a tribe of 1,000 diehard fans who will show up every time to buy your wares. Well, if you release $100 worth of merchandise a year, you're making $100,000 a year. And that seems to be more the future of where at least publishing is going.
Mm.
Because the big five publishers are just circling the drain. They're dying. Indie is capturing more and more of their market share. And as Vox Day has said, that's not a zero-sum game. That's a negative-sum game for them, for the big publishers, because every Kindle Unlimited download, every sale to an indie author like me on Amazon isn't one sale that the big five lose. It's two, because of the price differential and differences in distribution.
Interesting point. There's a similar phenomenon going on, I think, enabled by technology. You see it in movies, you see it in television. Especially, I think, in television. You see the progression. In the 1950s, there were, depending on where you were and stuff, 2, 3, 4 channels. And that kept up, I think, largely through, my memory's failing me slightly, but I think the 70s, roughly. Mm-hmm. You start getting more channels. By the 80s, you have 20, 30 channels in bigger metropolitan areas, less in smaller, still the age of broadcast. And then cable comes on, and you have even more these days. I haven't had a television service in something like 15 years now, but I'm told that there are 500, 600 channels in a basic cable thing. But at the same time, of course, each one gets a much smaller pie. It's very interesting. Are you familiar with what the most watched television episode ever is? Of scripted television, that is?
Oh my goodness, trivia time. Okay, let me try to guess here, because I was going to say one of the Super Bowls, but then you mentioned scripted.
Yeah, I mean, scripted, dramatic, although comedy, etc., all counts. But
okay, I'm like you. I haven't subscribed to television in years, but there are two I'm thinking of, which is either the last episode of MASH or the last episode of I Love Lucy. I'm going to say the last episode of I Love Lucy.
Actually, it's the last episode of MASH.
Oh, darn it, I should second guess myself.
Yeah, there weren't enough people watching TV in the end at I Love Lucy. Yeah, the final episode of MASH garnered 140 million people watching it. The second most watched, it's been a little while since I looked this up. The second most watched was something like, I think, 80 million or possibly less. And then I looked it up as of, I think I was looking this up last year. And so I think last year, the most watched episode in the last 10 years of scripted television was The Big Bang Show, one of the season finales, with, I think it was 20 million viewers. And so there's something, no, I'm sorry, it was like 14 million viewers, I think. It's somewhere in that range. It was something like in the, between 2000 and, in 2016, no single episode of television had garnered more than 25 million viewers. I think it might have been not even 20 million viewers. And so if you compare that to something like MASH in, I think that'd be the late 70s that it finished.
I think it was the early 80s. Tom Simon did a whole series of essays on MASH a little while ago.
Okay, so the early 80s, right about that time, incredibly popular, not that much. And so you had that phenomenon where there was a very shared popular culture. But again, now with several hundred channels, and these days they're competing with all sorts of YouTube shows. They're relatively popular, YouTube shows that can get several million views per episode. Some of the bigger ones, and a bunch of people do them. But again, there's so much competition that I think technology is pushing it in that direction where, with a bit of looking, you can find things that really suit your personality, that really suit your tastes in a way that was, much harder when distribution wasn't nearly so good. And so the upshot, when you can get that, when we've gotten something that really, really suits your tastes 5 or 6 or 7 times so far, you start, I think, becoming a lot more motivated to find that and a lot more discriminating when things don't. So I think there's an interesting push in terms of where our culture is shifting in that very small sort of, direction where we're all fans of fairly specific things.
Oh, absolutely. And there's also the element of not just one generation gap, but multiples. because the baby boomers are really the last generation to have their entertainment preferences revolve around and set by television. If you look at who is subscribing to television and who's not, millennials aren't. They're cutting the cable more and more frequently. I think only a third of them have television, at least in the traditional sense of subscribing to cable. I mean, they get it through like Hulu or Netflix or Amazon Prime, other like a collection of services. And the same goes for the nightly news. Really, only even older generations still watch or even trust the three major network news outlets.
Yeah, so, there's a news source I can't wait for it to die. The amount of damage that television news has done to society, I think would be difficult even to estimate. Well, it is in part the nature of constant news cycles, where you need to fill things, and consequently there becomes always that temptation to manufacture news, and hence things like the like the big like the razor blades and candy scare, where like one thing happens to one person somewhere, and then national news makes it out to be something big because there haven't been enough murders lately.
Exactly. That was actually one element I liked about Anchorman 2. I don't know if you saw that movie.
No, I haven't.
It actually does have some merit in terms of social commentary, because the plot of the movie revolves around a former local San Diego news anchor being chosen to head up the news team of the very first 24-hour news station. And at first, everyone thinks they're crazy. Like, 24-hour news, there just isn't that much to report on. There isn't that much happening. And the movie shows a highly dramatized and entertaining version of how they came up with, well, let's report on cats and human interest stories and just make stuff up. And
yeah, but there's a sort of interesting concomitant problem, which is that since these things were so expensive, it brought together three very different types of people. It brought together the TV, the actual news personalities. Mm-hmm. It brought together all the technical people that are involved, 20 years ago, especially when you didn't have things like webcams, but you had to have cameramen and so on. And I think most critically, it brought together those two with the businessmen who didn't care about any of this stuff. They only cared about making money. And the thing is, I think that's where a lot of the trust actually came from. It's not that people like businessmen, but you do expect them to be very self-interested in some very particular ways, especially they don't want to be sued. And because you trust them to really care about that, because it's in their self-interest, you expect that the organization that they're ultimately in charge of will be very careful about that sort of thing, in a way that, like one guy just writing on his blog, well, he could just be sloppy and just running whatever risk because there's no one to tell him, no, run this by the lawyers. But within a larger company, you have that run this by the lawyers thing. And consequently, I think that brings with it a large measure of, or that's a major source of the trust. So it really became, I think, a problem in terms of, when doing things like you described, the segments and blowing things out of proportion when you don't have much, just about making things up or outright making things up or so on. And yet you have all the businessmen behind you who lend you that credibility that there are people who are utterly unlike you who approve of what you're doing, and moreover, people who we generally trust to be relatively sensible and conservative in a practical sense who approve of what you're doing. And so a large enterprise inherently has a lot of approval built in, and especially being tribal creatures, social creatures rather. When we see a lot of people working together and approving, we tend to be much more willing to trust that sort of thing.
Right, and that definitely happens in network news. There's one counterexample I can think of. I recently finished reading Console Wars, a book by Blake J. Harris. We had him on Geek Gab recently. And it's all about the corporate commercial war between Sega and Nintendo back in the early to mid-90s. Yes, with the Sega Genesis first competing against the original NES, and then the release of the Super Nintendo, and Tom Kalinske, the third man, I believe, to be the president of Sega of America, who was brought in specifically because of his past marketing successes. He'd been the president of Mattel and pretty much brought Barbie back from the brink of oblivion. He did about the same thing for Matchbox cars. He co-invented Masters of the Universe and Flintstone vitamins. So he's got a string of successes. Yeah, he's a brilliant marketer, and he took Sega from just an infinitesimal, negligible market share to beating Nintendo and having something like 54% of the market.
Really, they got that high?
Yeah, they got a majority of the market.
Huh. Living through it at the time, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I recommend this book then. It is full of tidbits like that. But the way that he and his team did it was, first he built a team that he knew he could trust, and he didn't have to micromanage. You could tell them, okay, go plan this tour, go commission a commercial that will reach this type of audience, build me some hardware that will do this, and would trust him to go do it. But then also, he was very customer centric. They had a mantra that Blake recounts: the name of the game is the game. Where, yeah, the Genesis was inferior hardware in most respects, but many people to this day say that its games were just more fun than especially many of the first party Nintendo titles. Like if you compare Sonic to Mario. And I'm an SNES guy, and I'm a Nintendo fanboy from way back, but I had to concede a lot of these points because the proof is in the pudding, and they pulled it off by picking a demographic to appeal to, which was a bit older than Nintendo's. Nintendo was aiming for more like the 8 to 14 crowd, and Sega was going for more like the 12 to 18, or pushing a bit older. So their commercials were edgier and took a bit more risk, actually. And so that really jives with what you said, because they originally had carte blanche from Sega of Japan to do pretty much whatever they wanted. Although that was really restrained in later, and is a big contributing factor into why they eventually failed. But for a while, I believe one quote for the book was, "It's like having money in high school."
Usually a terrible combination.
Right, so they could just really get away with murder, and were just directly attacking Nintendo for being staid and old and stodgy. And Nintendo was more of the play it safe, conservative, reserved company who really never shot back at Sega directly. And that cost him. So, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that brings up a very interesting point, I think, which segues a bit into writing. Because I want to talk about the writing and the craft of writing and nature of stories. And there's a phenomenon, I mean, we've seen over and over in our culture, I'm trying to think. Well, actually, a good name for it is being subversive. That violating taboos, for example.
Right.
It's a great way of getting attention, but the problem with violating taboos is that titillation wears off fairly quickly. And I mean, in a broader cultural sense, I mean, we're seeing kind of the almost, in a sense, at least I find it relatively hilarious phenomenon in which traditional culture had become so undermined by popular entertainment and so on, and that being in favor of things like sexual promiscuity, describing, using almost pornographic language, telling pornographic jokes and so on in a casual sort of way, and so forth. I'm thinking people like Andrew Dice Clay, which is not a perfect description of him, but even George Carlin, one of his most famous routines was violating the social norms of words that you shouldn't say in polite company. The 7 words you shouldn't say on television,
right?
Sketch, which wasn't his best, but it's, I think, maybe one of the ones he's best known for. But all of these things, had played out so much, and especially the sort of, politically liberal stuff had played out so much that these days, the way that people are edgy and trigger, our generation's, modern times version of the squares is by being conservative. And you can see that actually in people like Milo Yiannopoulos, where he triggers an astonishing number of people. He really, angers and shocks people and so on by stating things like that people should get married to have sex. Well, at least I think he
Right.
believes in straight people.
Right. Well, one of Milo's most frequently made observations is that if you want to be punk rock nowadays, the contemporary equivalent of being a punk rocker is being a conservative, especially in a social sense.
Yeah, well, and especially in any sort of setting like a college setting or entertainment setting and so on. So, I mean, the nature of that's the problem with shocking people is that shocking is always very temporary. And the problem, there's in a broader sense, parasitism is always easy because you're reaping what you didn't sow.
Right.
That's always the nature of a parasite. Is a parasite does that, but the problem is, of course, especially fungal parasites, I think, are perhaps the best example. And you can see this a lot, because the fungus, decomposes plants that had built things up before them. But the problem is eventually you run out of the corpse that you're feeding on. And my sense of our current social environment, and consequently of our entertainment, is that we've largely hit that point. I mean, at this point, in his day, Chester had mentioned that we've already asked all the questions. We've run out of questions to ask, and added, it's time we actually started looking for some answers. But unfortunately, a lot of people didn't, and that played out for a while. But it feels to me like popular culture has largely run out of the corpse to decompose further of Christendom within culture. And so it becomes, when it comes to entertainment, now that there are people, I mean, I've written a few books that haven't sold very much, especially in comparison to yours, but people like you and I and Russell and other people, actually, the three of us are Catholic. There must be a few Orthodox who are writing books, as well as other Christians, but people who will build it up again. And so, what do you think of that evaluation, and do you see that as, in a sense, an opportunity, and also as an as yet underserved need?
Your evaluation is absolutely correct. The West at this point in time is creatively, morally, and intellectually and spiritually exhausted. We were coasting on the social capital that Christendom built up. And a lot of people would say since the Enlightenment. I would put it back before that. I would say since the High Middle Ages. That's more where I would put the zenith of Western culture. And it was such a rich treasure trove that it took us a while to deplete it, but we have. Getting back to what you said about subversion, you may have heard of the Turkey City Lexicon.
I haven't, actually. What is that?
It's a collection of writing terms, I suppose you should say, or cliches, but one of them is burning the motherhood statement. And that is a trope where the motherhood statement is like any reference to like mom, apple pie, traditional morality, or values. And so a story that burns the motherhood statement subverts that. And the lexicon goes so far as to say that, well, it's the duty of science fiction authors to write stories that burn the motherhood statement. Well, now it's been done so much that, like you said, we've gotten desensitized. And so actually restating the motherhood statement is now subversive, or superversive, as my friends at the Superversive crew would say. And the way this plays out in film is, well, take a look at Star Wars. Okay, so Star Wars came out in late 70s, early 80s, was a cultural phenomenon, right place, right time. We needed that shot in the arm after the stagflation and malaise and the Vietnam War. So originally, the original Star Wars was kind of a mini renewal, like you're talking about, because it went back to Campbell, went back to the traditions of Western culture, going all the way back to the Iliad and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and mixed it together into something new and original, and presented in a way that said, hey, see, Western culture isn't that bad. We got some fight left in us yet. I mean, Lucas said that his purpose for including the Force in Star Wars was to make people think about God. Like not just a vague Taoist or Eastern sort of pantheism, but the God. But if you look what's happened since then, lost both with his own failure to make lightning strike twice with the prequels, which were undeniably artistic failures, though commercially successful. At least they were an honest attempt. He gave it the old college try.
One thing I will say in defense of not the first and not the second, well, actually, one thing I will say slightly in defense of the first is there was a sort of he actually did a fairly decent job, I think, of making young Anakin Skywalker fairly morally good, which was very chilling when you knew what he was going to become. The large portions of it were very iffy, to be sure. I'm talking about 3% of the movie had that element. The middle one, the middle one was the one where Anakin had the golden flipper at the end, didn't he?
Yes.
Such a bizarre thing. But the one thing I will say in defense, the other thing I want to say in defense of the third of the prequels, artistically, well, in a sense artistically, was that I think that the fall of Anakin Skywalker was done very interestingly in that it was far more realistic than it was believable.
Interesting.
And that is in particular, because if you look at the structure of what happened, Anakin Skywalker, he's getting more and more interested in Palpatine. But there's nothing obviously wrong with Palpatine. I mean, he's iffy, to be sure, but there's nothing, he's not crossing a line there. And he's talking with Palpatine, he's finding this interesting, and, obviously he's getting a sense that maybe I shouldn't be here, but on the other hand, there's nothing where he's not violating anything. He's not violating any promise that he made. He's not violating any moral precept by what he's doing. It's just iffy. Then when you finally get to that scene, where he goes and defends Palpatine, it was a morally defensible action that he did. When he was saying, no, you can't just strike him down. He deserves, if memory serves, it was like he deserves a trial or something to that effect.
Yes.
Which was a morally defensible action. And then what happened afterwards, when Palpatine goes and murders Mace Windu, at that point, Palpatine convinces Anakin that he had already made his decision when he hadn't. And that's how that sort of thing very often does happen. That when people go bad, they do morally ambiguous things that could be good, and then at some point sort of decide that they've already crossed the line when they really hadn't up until that decision. And that's what Anakin does. He decides that he's persuaded, but essentially decides that he had turned to the dark side before he actually did. And it's that psychological thinking of it as something that he had already done, a step already taken, wherein he reinterprets a morally defensible action to be indefensible and consequently something he did wrong, that then enables him to go and just sort of go with it, because better to be hanged a sheep than a lamb.
Right, and I'd agree with that. That's why I'd say that the prequel trilogy is actually an attempt to create art. It has some merit, and the third is by far the best of the three, largely because of Anakin's downfall, which again, there were some missteps, there were some missed opportunities in it. We could debate over where those were. I think your assessment holds up. But then...
Yeah, I mean, I do think it kind of bizarre that he then sent Anakin, in a sense, the most powerful now of the Jedi, to go and kill the defenseless children, rather than, do something actually militarily useful. I mean, at least if nothing else, it was just artistically bizarre.
It was. But if we now look at The Force Awakens, the newest Star Wars movie to receive a Roman numeral, it's just propaganda. It is not art. It makes no attempt to be so. It is compromised at every turn by political correctness and an attempt to pontificate. So there, they've already exhausted it. And again, this year had another one, which I didn't even bother to see, but just looking at the trailers, I was looking at and watching the scene with the Star Destroyers flying in front of the Death Star, and it just struck me, well, we first saw these same images more than 40 years ago. So our culture is still can't let go of a cultural paradigm shift that happened in the 1970s. Why has there been nothing since then? Why has nothing else taken that place?
Well, there's actually a great Onion article on that very phenomenon, the constant revisiting of things already done. It was I don't know if you happen to see it. I don't see much, but this one got passed around. But it was about how the MPAA adds a rating, an O rating for original content, to warn audiences in case there's something new that they're unfamiliar with. And there's the great thing at the went through talking about this and quoting people who were in shock that 7 minutes in and there was nobody that they knew. But then at the end they had this great thing about we're not trying to censor anybody. You can make it, and this way we're just warning audiences. But if you want to avoid an O rating, all you have to do is license a comic book character or cartoon character or something and stick them in. So I mean, it's something very, I think, incredibly noticeable. I mean, to the point where, I mean, I think I saw Sesame Street joking about this, where there's an Elmo, I think it was Elmo, who was talking about doing something, and then he'd do the sequel, and then he'd do a prequel, and then he'd do a reboot, then he'd do a prequel to the reboot, and then he'd do another reboot and then a prequel. And by the time you're joking about this in children's stuff, I've got 3 young children, so I see more children's stuff than adult stuff these days.
Right.
But by the time you're joking about how worn out the culture is, I mean, but on the flip side, if you think back to Homer's day, you brought up Homer, people retold the Iliad an awful lot. I mean, granted, they retold the actual Iliad. They didn't reboot it 17 times. But so, I mean, we might actually, in that sense, even though we're seeing a creative exhaustion, it's possible there is something a bit traditional in a creative exhaustion.
Oh, certainly there is, and I'm not talking about just a blind addiction to novelty, where we throw out all tradition and destroy all the icons. But I'm speaking more of the baffling failure that if you think about the creative boom from the inception of Hollywood until Star Wars, of really anything else comparable to come along. Because if you remember, okay, the last original Star Wars movie came out in 1983, which incidentally I looked up, that was the same year as the last episode of MASH. Coincidence? I don't know. But all right, so, and I lived through this. So probably about the end of 1984, the initial frenzy, the rapture from the release of Return of the Jedi had largely died down. And there was a period there for about 10 years where Star Wars was not ubiquitous. And honestly, people forgot about it. It would be on Thanksgiving afternoon and evening on the USA Network, where they show all 3 movies back to back. And they had the Droids cartoon, occasionally see a kid with a lunchbox. But that was it. The action figures were unavailable, or limited availability for a long time. There were no new movies. And it really didn't start getting popular again until the mid to late 90s with the release of Star Wars video games. And then leading into the special editions. So we've got about 10 years there where really Hollywood had the technical know-how and the tools to produce something else. It didn't have to be a space opera. It could have been something else taken from the pulp. So I know there was Indiana Jones, but it was never that big with kids. If you look at how the toy sales went as a barometer of popularity with children, I mean, when have you seen an Indiana Jones toy marketed at the same age group as Star Wars? That's because it was far more mature.
Yeah.
There was just there was just a vacuum that wasn't filled. And it's not as if Star Wars is just the pinnacle of Western storytelling. I mean, there are better things that can be done. There are other songs to be sung there, but they just weren't for some reason. And I think it's that social capital exhaustion.
Mm. Now, well, two things I want to talk about. And well, okay, the thing about social capital and rebuilding it, because one of the things that I found very curious, and not just within art, but in other cases too, because in these days and for a long time, for a very long time actually, hating the Catholic Church has been very popular, and one of the things that occurred to me, of course, is that the Catholic Church is very confident in what it is. That it is held for the last 2,000 years, that it has the deposit of truth, and that it's safeguarding it, and so it just keeps on going, being what it is, not asking anybody else's permission, just doing it. So the great thing about this is, if you don't, from an external perspective, is if you don't have a particularly good reason to get up in the morning, you kind of need to leech off of somebody else's reason to get up in the morning. And we see a lot of that. The nature of there's to be critical of things can be very valuable. It can even be an art form. It can be very humorous. I'm a big fan of Mystery Science Theater 3000. But at the same time, there is a subset of that wherein, if you didn't have somebody to criticize, there are people for whom, if they didn't have someone to criticize, they wouldn't get up in the morning. And somebody who routinely gets up every morning is really invigorating in that sense. And so, and the thing relating to writing, I think, is that there are a lot of people, I think, for whom, those of us who both like to tell stories, and I don't want to just limit this to Catholic, but Orthodox Christians more generally, that one of the things about fiction that I think is very useful is not as a teaching tool, but rather that what becomes interesting in fiction is taking truths and making them accessible in a way that they would not be in, say, prose. That to actually, to take moral conflicts, to take moral dimensions, to take moral questions, and to essentially have people live them out is itself a fascinating thing, and from our perspective, very worthwhile in itself. So, so to actually bring this to a point as a question, when it comes to fiction, how much do you see? Because one of my pet peeves is the idea that all characters must be flawed, which is something perhaps we can talk about later. But to what degree do you see that the intersection of not teaching in a didactic sense, but the exploration of truth as one of the purposes of popular entertaining fiction? The exploration of truth is itself the entertainment that can be popular. I mean,
no, that's a fantastic question to bring up, because it's right in my wheelhouse. So, first of all, I very much hold with Josef Pieper, the great German Catholic philosopher, who talked about art and what the purpose of art is. And really, art is that which has no purpose. It has no utilitarian end. That is why I say something like The Force Awakens is not art, because it definitely has an agenda that the writer and producer and director all admitted to. So look at the difference between like Soviet era propaganda posters and then like a brilliantly carved and painted altarpiece from Ghent or somewhere. And in the Christian art, even though it's definitely got a theme within it, it exists only to glorify God. It isn't necessarily even trying to preach. It's just the best Christian art is trying to be beautiful, because that's enough, because beauty is truth. Now, on the other hand, that doesn't mean you can't have a theme or message wrapped up in or intrinsic to, or suppose shot through your art. But the primary thing that art needs to do is provide people a chance for leisure, which again is an end in and of itself. Really, Pieper would say that the contemporary really post-Protestant work ethic West has our priorities backwards, where we see leisure time as being R&R to recharge our batteries so that we can go back to work, which is the real purpose of life. He says, no, says Pieper, we work so that we can have leisure.
Would this be in his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture?
It would, yes. Which
Okay.
the title gives away. Yes, that leisure is what all culture points of view. You read it?
I have 20 some odd years ago in high school, but yes, I have.
Excellent. So they're really, I think that they really are compatible, that you can use art to teach because, again, as you mentioned earlier, if you're being honest with your art, we're writers in particular, if you're conveying truths in an entertaining way, that alone will convey truth. So in my Soul Cycle, to give a personal example, part of the genesis of that series was to address Manichaeism. So a lot of people have acclaimed it for having a totally original cosmos because the story isn't set in the distant past like Robert E. Howard Conan stories or Tolkien's Middle Earth. It's not set in the far future like Dune. It's in a totally separate cosmos that has never been ours and has almost no relation to ours. So I started building from scratch. And
can you give like a 10-second summary of Manichaeism? Because it's not the most popular heresy by name these days.
No, but it might be the most popular indeed. So, yes, Manichaeism is a branch of Gnosticism. Okay, for those listening out there, Gnosticism is based on the Greek gnosos, which means knowledge, and is based on the idea of getting secret knowledge or salvation only being accessible to those who have this secret hidden knowledge. Augustine of Hippo was a Manichaean before he converted to Catholicism, and Manichaeism in particular, I won't get too deeply into what the original Manichaean heretics believe because it gets pretty weird, like about different foods being inhabited by different spirits, and so these weird dietary restrictions. But it's the idea that good and evil are equal. So it's a form of black and white morality, but it's not as simple as saying black and white morality. But it's a black and white morality where they try to solve the problem of evil. Well, if God is all good, how can there, all good and all powerful, how can there be evil in the world? By saying, well, there's another God who is equal to the good God, only he's evil and he created all evil. So you have good and evil as being these two equal and eternally opposed forces striving against each other. So I set up the Soul Cycle universe where that's true, and that's what's been going on since the beginning of my Secondary Worlds Cosmos. So an undercurrent, a theme running throughout all three books so far, and it's going to be in the fourth and final one, is how this just doesn't work. It's all the absurdities of Manichaeism, the chief one being, well, if evil is equal to good, you haven't really resolved the problem of evil at all. You've just kicked the can a little farther down the road, because then the question is, well, why choose good? And there's really no answer. And you could just as easily choose evil.
There's a really interesting... have you read Dragonlance by any chance?
I've read the role-playing game supplement. I haven't actually read any of the Wise and Hickman books.
I can recommend the Dragonlance Chronicles and the Dragonlance Legends, the latter being probably better than the former, but the former being good too. And now, I'll note again, I was a teenager when I read these, and they're somewhat formative fiction for me. Formative fiction, we all tend to have those things that are sort of formative, and consequently we sort of often love them in a somewhat outsized way. So with that caveat, but I've got another friend with decent taste who also loves them, although again they were formative fiction for him as well. But the reason I bring them up is because it has a standard classical Dungeons and Dragons collection of gods, which you can arrange in the circle with the opposed gods, and for reasons having to do with the mechanics of the priestly spells. But the problem they have is they have a god of good and a god of evil. They also have a god of neutrality who essentially never shows up. And then it gets really there's some other things that are a little iffy, but the curious thing is each one has its domain. That Paladine, the god of good, has his, which is sort of vaguely portrayed, kind of like the Christian heaven, and Takesis has hers, the abyss, which is sort of portrayed like a Christian hell. Except that each one of them is actually responsible for having created their own species. Paladine, the elves, and Takesis, the orcs, was it? Anyway, something along those lines. Orcs or ogres, something like that. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that the orcs and ogres, being themselves evil, should find the abyss actually very, very well suited to them. They should find it very natural, and consequently, the place they want to be, such that if they actually went to Paladine's realm, where everything would just be utterly wrong, it'd be a mismatch to their nature, whereas the abyss should be a proper match. They should, in that sense, be happy. And so what you have is not good versus evil, but really just two distinctly opposing goods. Where if Takesis created I'm just going to go with orcs, even though I don't think that's quite right. But if Takesis created the orcs, then it makes sense that she would, care about the orcs. It would make sense that she would not care at all about these other, elves that she didn't have any hand in creating. And so that she would treat those badly makes a great deal of sense in taking care of her creations. Because of course they don't have creator gods, they have craftsman gods. And the same thing for Paladine. So, humans tend to align with Paladine for some reason not well specified in the books. And we get the human perspective, but this becomes that fundamental problem of, well, really she's just looking after her creations. And yeah, she's treating the other things badly, but well, from a wolf's perspective, we're pretty awful. On the other hand, from our perspective, we take care of our children, so we shoot wolves in order to keep them from eating our children.
Right. What you're getting at is in a system like that, there's no escape from moral relativism.
Well, I actually will say I think it's reconcilable with moral absolutes, given that given a hierarchy of responsibilities, in the same way that a wolf has responsibility to her, a wolf has responsibility to its cub, and we have responsibility to our children, and this will sometimes put us in inevitable conflict in this fallen world. And yet, it's not a morally relativist system. It's just we each have, we each have our primary responsibilities, and sometimes these conflict. So I think it can be resolved that way, at least, from somebody. If somebody were writing this who had we're attempting to do decent moral philosophy, they could resolve it properly, where there's simply in a fallen world a clash of, a clash of priorities, essentially.
Okay.
Without it being morally relativist. I'll grant you, probably most authors today would go in a morally relativist direction. But I think it's analyzable in a morally absolute system, simply, in the same sense that, even, human on human, you can have situations where two good men on different sides of a war have to try to kill each other, even though they don't have any personal quarrel, and neither of them is doing anything wrong in their attempt to fulfill their duty. Which
right,
is
I was referring back more to the original. I should have clarified the original Manichaean ideal, where you have two gods, one specifically said to be good and created all good things, and one specifically said to be evil and responsible for all moral and physical evil.
Well, being Gnostics, the reason I brought up Dragonlance, because I'm more familiar with Gnosticism than Manichaeism. Like Gnosticism as described by St. Irenaeus in Against the Heresies.
Right.
Which predates, it was Mani, was his name?
Yes. His name was Mani, indeed, although spelled Mani, I believe. Yeah.
So in that, there was a god, essentially like a god the Father,
right,
who was completely and utterly inaccessible to us. And he created a number of, and I can't remember what the heck they were called these days, but essentially like, gods with a lowercase g, of which the Hebrew Yahweh was one of these. Or no, I'm sorry, he wasn't. His mother was one of them. So within Manichaeism, were these two gods actually properly both created by some higher god that just had nothing to do with us? or did he go full bore on these are two co-equal, but with nothing above them?
It's been years since I've looked it up, so I'm gonna have to research that and get back to you. But my very strong memory impression is that they were co-equal and were both creators, like first principles.
Interesting. So now, in any event, is that the direction you took it in the Soul Cycle? That you have these two, but you're exploring how this just doesn't work. They can't actually. Well, I'm sorry. I'm practically asking you to give away the ending.
Well, what I can tell you, what would be accessible to the reader within the first couple chapters of Ethereal is that, first of all, the prevailing ideology in the cosmos at this point is a sort of reductive, agnostic, bordering on atheist materialism, where really there's no open worship of any deities. There are no organized faiths any longer. People have really descended into sort of a gray drab consumerism, and the more learned classes think, okay, well, could be some transcendent principle, but it, so why posit, why invoke entities beyond what is strictly necessary to explain events, right?
Thomas.
Right. So about it, but there are signs of a vestigial sort of residual belief in two deities named Zadok and Thera. Zadok being the All-Father, the good God in terms of a standard of good. He's not compassionate. He's like halfway between the deist watchmaker, who just set everything in motion, let everything run, and sort of God the Father as initially revealed in the Torah. But a little bit more insular. So he's described more as a just judge than a loving deity. And Thera is described as Zadok's daughter, and she's a goddess of evil. She introduces all disorder, both physical and moral, into the world. By her first act, upon her creation by Zadok, she kills her father. And that's what sparks the universe. So the very first act of creation of this world is a murder.
Interesting.
In fact, a patricide, regicide, and deicide all at the same time. I can keep going with this if you want to. Again, I don't want to give too much away.
Yeah. No, that's it's a very interesting premise.
Thank you.
It's a very interesting premise. Also reminds me of some elements of not very much of Gnosticism, the early Gnosticism, but it's an interesting. It's an interesting. My mind's already racing with all the different possible ways it could go from there. So do you do this whenever you read other fiction? Do you get distracted by how you might go?
Yes. It can be hard to turn my inner editor off. So as a result, I read very slowly. I don't get nearly as much reading done as some of my peers do.
Yeah, I've personally found. I mean, unfortunately, I don't get much reading done lately, mostly on account of having small children that I'm looking after. So to some degree, I'm coasting on. I'm closer to 40 than I am to 30, and to some degree, I'm coasting on the reading I did between roughly 6 and about 32.
Right.
So now I did a fair amount of reading during that time. Fortunately, I didn't fritter away all my youth, so I've got some in the tank, as it were. But unfortunately, I mean, I really feel the lack of it. I have a hard time getting in. But I've also found just that I get, especially, I think especially since I did, having really written and taking stories to completion, I get very, very invested in characters. So it actually has led to me being a little bit, having a little bit of an initial hesitance to take up anything I haven't already read before, just because I'm going to get so invested in it, whether or not it's written well, not in the artistic sense, but in the moral sense, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
Um,
Like you said
it,
earlier, you when your idea that all the idea that all characters have to be flawed now to be believable or some such.
Mm. Yeah, I can't stand this idea. I mean, first thing, and this is from a purely Christian perspective, the idea that you could not write interesting fiction, that if the world, I'm sorry, if the fall of man had not happened, if man had not sinned, it would be impossible to write interesting fiction, seems to me to be on its face obviously ridiculous. Um, and there's an asterisk. It's not necessarily the case that a perfect world would include fiction, because it's possible that nobody would have any need for it. The ability to appreciate being undamaged, we'd appreciate everything around us so well. So I'm not saying that necessarily in an unfallen world you would have fiction, um, but at the same time, the most interesting character that has ever been described is Jesus Christ. Since you can have characters in history, and he is in no sense flawed, and I've always found him to be the most interesting. I mean, interesting to the point almost of being terrible in the original sense, inspiring terror. Um, so interesting that it almost becomes scary to contemplate in my experience. Um, but so there's that counterexample too, and the flip side, of course, if characters need to be flawed to be interesting, well, you can just have a lying cheater dying of heroin in the gutter, and man, do you have a flawed character who's got to be the most interesting thing to exist in between slobbering, I guess.
Right. Yeah. It's a manifestation of the lie that sin is somehow intrinsic to human nature.
Mm.
Right. This idea of taking to err is human, a little too far, making it definitive. Okay. And that's, again, yeah, that's not the case. We were not made to sin. God would not create a being just for the purpose of offending his majesty. We were made for union with God. So, and also if to sin were in our nature, there would be no such thing as sin, because it would be natural for us to do it. And
Therefore good.
That's a self-negating proposition.
It really is. Well, especially it becomes, I think, especially clear when sin is understood as a negation. That sin is in the scholastic terms the privation of form.
Yes.
Although it's a little dangerous to use without defining terms for a general audience. Privation, from deprivation, for those listening. And do you want to take a stab at defining form briefly?
No, go ahead, because I haven't heard it phrased exactly like that.
Privation. I think St. Thomas describes sin as privation of form.
I've heard it described as a privation of the good. Or privation of nature.
Okay, I mean, form.
We're talking essay, like in the Aristotelian term.
Yes, yeah, form in the Aristotelian sense.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't. Well, I mean, in the scholastic sense, really, but that's very close to the Aristotelian sense. The simple thing that all things that are within time, the things we're familiar with, are all made of matter and form. And matter being the thing, and form being, in a sense, the way it is. If one sort of takes shape and generalizes it into things like action and so on. So that the definition of or the Aristotelian definition of our soul is the form of our body. And so the I don't know. I guess privation of form especially stuck with me because when I was in college, I did a independent study into the metaphysical presuppositions of morality, and it was very disappointing too because the professor I was doing it with, I went to a small college, and At one point I was meeting with him, and he wasn't talking with me that much. He was more just giving me reading lists, which was a little bit disappointing when we met, because, I mean, why are we meeting? You could email me a reading list. But also, what was really disappointing is when he finally said that he thought that people got way too hung up on contradictions. That it really should, arguments should be much more like horse jumping. You have a horse run, you might get 4 faults, and you say it's a really good run. I mean, it got 4 faults, but it was a very good run. And it should be like that. It was a really good argument. I mean, there's a contradiction in it, but only one. It was a really good argument. And that was the day my philosophy major became a philosophy minor.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, he's one of the 3 philosophy professors in the department. The other 2 were no better. And well, actually, one of them was better. I took 1 or 2 more courses actually with that 3rd professor. But yeah, it was a sort of shocking moment. But eventually, I had come to the conclusion roughly that morality, the underpinning of morality, was the maximization of being. But I sort of using definitions that I kind of had in my head and didn't put down on paper very well. And then when I finally actually read a tiny portion of the Summa. I'm gesturing at it because it's actually on my shelf right there.
As it should be.
I was so happy the day I finally could have, it was $140 when I bought it. I was so happy the day I finally opened the thing, just here's this wealth of knowledge right there finally in my house. But anyhow, and I looked up, the relevant sections, and he describes sin as the privation of form, which is just the flip side of what my description was, just that sort of in photographic negative. And I was just utterly delighted that I had hit upon this, and then, turned out to be right.
Yeah,
in that sense.
Well, that's how Augustine, and then later the scholastics building on him, got around the Manichaeans, and it's how they address the problem of evil, which is that, well, man creates nothing. Exactly. Sin is nothing. Evil is the one thing we can bring ex nihilo into the world, because it is nihilo. It's so God.
Nihilo nihil fit.
Exactly. God creates, and everything he creates is good, because goodness is being, like you said. It's the maximization of being. As Boethius said, the whole and perfect possession of unlimited being at once. So we can, even though we're limited creatures, because we're limited creatures, yeah, we can throw a wrench in the works. We can introduce nothingness into being, and that's what evil is. It's a deprivation. So it's not a positive. It doesn't have positive existence. It's as Aquinas said, sickness is the absence of health. It's a deficiency of health. Ignorance is a deficiency of knowledge, etc.
Yeah, a shadow, I think, is I don't know if a shadow was a metaphor in Aquinas' time, but I think it's a common enough metaphor now. Mm-hmm. That a shadow looks like it's something, but in fact, it's actually just the absence of light.
Brilliant, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that does, especially once you understand it in that sense. And there are particular cases that can be difficult to work out, because there are various things, we describe as sinful that look like, that are positive actions. Like, murdering somebody is a positive action. So it can be difficult to see in all circumstances where it is actually merely a negation. Although actually, I do think, not getting too far off, that a lot of what solves that is really looking at how creation unfolds and looking at all the things that we do as being a participation in God. Mm-hmm. Like taking the example of when you see a hungry man and you give him food, you are being God's act of feeding this man. Now, he was hungry up to this point because somebody was actually shirking their duty of feeding him. But in that act of feeding him, you are actually being God's act of sustaining his existence. Or, the action of parents of creating a child and calling, in a sense, calling that child out of nothing. That one is becoming in that act of procreation, the parents are being God's act of creating that child. And so as such, God is actually incorporating us into his creative action. Because of course he could have just created us all separately, all simultaneously and so on, but he actually delegates to us his action of goodness. And so there are a lot of things that I think are very underappreciated because we so take them for granted. Um, that things like not interfering with another's act of living is itself part of the thing we have been given to do. And so when you do something like murder, you're actually leaving. Um, you are not doing that thing that you are supposed to have been doing. So I think looking at it that way does help to. I'm mentioning this for people for whom this is sort of a new concept, but I think that helps to resolve. That's a direction to go to help resolve some of that. But evil looks like a positive thing. Nazi death camps or something like that.
Right, or a device that was invented only to torture innocent people, and that seems to be its form. Its form is just to inflict pain. There are a lot of examples, but yeah, I think you found a hermeneutic key, as we call it, to help unlock the problem of suffering, the problem of evil. And yeah, it's that God can and does mediate creation through secondary causes like us. Secondary causality is something else that everybody missed for hundreds of years in trying to address these problems. So yeah, I find it fascinating.
There's also, when I apologize. I lost. There's something very interesting in what you said, and I apologize. I got distracted by something else interesting that you said. Oh yes, I'm sorry. You'd mentioned the problem of evil, and what's interesting, especially when looked at this way, is there becomes, I think, and it gets very under-remarked upon, though I appreciate it enough, I think, but just not remarked upon much, that for the atheist there becomes the concomitant problem of good. That since morality is very clearly, good is being, obviously. I'm sorry, not obviously, but when you consider it, it becomes very clear that under any morality that any human beings actually hold, it is. Accepting mistakes that they make within it. And so the atheist is left with a very strange problem, which is the problem of good, which is how can you have shadows with no light? Mm-hmm. Or relatedly, how is it that you can have light? I mean, we can see the shadows and we can see that there's some, some light. How can you have this without a light source? So I think the atheist is in that position of seeing shadows and identifying shadows. Atheists reasonably well known for railing against injustices in the world. Or even if you want to hold injustices up as disproving God, you then have the odd thing of using the shadows to disprove the light source.
Right, and no one actually does really hold up the shadows as a disproof of God, because that's the thing about the problem of evil. It doesn't address God's existence per se. It attempts to scandalize people into rejecting either God's goodness or his omnipotence. But it doesn't really touch God's existence, as it were.
Interesting point.
It's not mine originally, but yeah, I mean, really, I've never personally found the problem of evil very challenging because there's really no direct contradiction in it. Because one can easily say, okay, there is evil. We can see it. It's obvious. That the shadows are there to be seen. And there's an all-good, omniscient, omnipresent, all-powerful God. A and B, you can say both, because there's a missing premise in it, which is that the existence of an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipresent God is incompatible with the existence of evil, but that's a circular argument.
Yeah, I'm in the same camp. It was never a problem, an intellectual problem for me. And also just on a practical note, although I don't have, sufficiently wide knowledge to really back this up, I'm sure there are exceptions. I've generally seen the problem of evil tends to be is rarely a problem, or the problem of pain, as C.S. Lewis called it. Mm-hmm. I think somewhat aptly for the modern world. The curious thing about the problem of pain is it tends to apply to other people's pain. that, I mean, people who are really suffering don't tend to worry about this nearly so much. In fact, tend to be much more in the habit of calling on God than people who are looking at somebody else's pain.
Fascinating. Yeah, I didn't think about that, but
it's a casual. It's an observation I've made through life. I'm sure there are exceptions. I mean, I'm sure there's an exception somewhere. Whole collection of exceptions, but usually the people who bring this up are not people who are suffering. They're too busy, sort of staring reality in the face and not being able to escape. It's people who are comfortable in looking at suffering from a distance who get really worried by it.
Interesting.
So I'm sorry, we're rather far afield of fiction, though. So bring it back in keeping the moral dimension. I'm curious what you in terms of either what you like to write or what you like to read. Although there's probably a large coincidence between those two things. What sort of moral situations, dilemmas, whatever exactly you want to call them, do you tend to find the most interesting in fiction?
I find it interesting when characters aren't faced with a choice between necessarily doing the right thing and the wrong thing, and they're clearly delineated, but both sort of the no-win situation where, all right, you have two choices, none of them particularly pleasant or optimal, and you're between a rock and a hard place, but you've got to choose, or a choice between two goods, which is one that everybody seems to forget about.
I wrote about that very thing recently. I'm curious if you would elaborate a bit.
Okay. Well, I was actually having a discussion on Twitter a while ago with a wonderful LDS gentleman amongst the Church of Latter-day Saints, and we were actually discussing the problem of evil, and he had actually said and claimed it was part of Mormon teaching, although I'm not an expert on that. I'm not claiming this. It's just what he told me, was that it's a part of Mormon teaching that good and evil must both exist. The good couldn't exist without evil. And he said it's necessary for free will. There has to be, in order to choose good, to be free to choose good, there has to be an opposite evil choice. And so I brought up to him, well, what about when you have to choose between two goods? What about when you have to choose between marrying only one of two equally moral, feminine, beautiful, upstanding, motherly women? You have to flip the coin. You know what? Because really, most of our choices are like that, or degrees of it.
Yeah. I think few of us are in that exact situation.
I'm not, unfortunately, but
yeah. But that being said, they're practical aspects I think tend to keep us out of that exact situation. But as a metaphor, it works very well for all sorts of things. Especially anything having to do with hobbies is lowering it down in seriousness a few notches. But should I take up trout fishing or flying a kite or painting or target shooting or what have you? On a practical level, everyone's in that circumstance because they could always put down their current hobby and take up a new one. More relatable, less intense. But by the way, did he mean that actual evil was needed or only potential evil?
We were limited to 140 characters at a time, so I'm not comfortable. I would have to read his heart in order to say that.
Gotcha. Because if it was potential evil, then I think he'd be on relatively safe ground. That to have free will at all is to, any free-willed entity will always have the option of not doing anything, and consequent, and not doing anything would be a privation. So I mean, as long as it's potential, I think you'd be on safe ground because free will implies the ability to do something wrong.
Right.
But nonetheless, sorry, let's take
charity. Interpret your opponent's claiming the strongest way possible. So let's just
Yeah,
well,
we'll go with that for that
yeah.
argument that we don't even have in front of us anyway. I'm terrible with going off on tangents. All the world's interesting, I think, and so I constantly going every which way. But I'm sorry to bring it back. So could you elaborate a little further on that? Now that you've illustrated that you've illustrated sort of that choosing between different goods. Can you think of an example? Either in fiction you've written or someone else has written that comes to mind of that sort of
Well,
choice for
I
an
was
interesting character, interesting scene or setting or.
so I was so I was, so I was thinking of Tolkien
Mhm.
in Lord of the Rings. So if you look at the position of the elves, specifically Elrond and Galadriel, okay, so
Mhm.
they face a choice between two evils because now that the One Ring has been found and the enemy might regain it, and they're in a position to either help or hinder or do nothing for the Fellowship, who are on their way to destroy the Master Ring. They'll also destroy their rings that sustain their realms. So they have a choice of either doing nothing and risking that the one is returned to its owner, who will then dominate the world,
Hmm.
or helping to destroy it and thus undoing their power and sealing the fate of their entire race.
Mm.
So the stakes are very high for them, and the actions that Elrond and Galadriel take really drive home their moral character because they both make the right choice.
Mm.
Even though Galadriel in that famous scene where Frodo offers her the ring is sorely tempted and she undergoes a moral test and passes it. And then Elrond has the double, really the triple sort of no-win situation where his daughter is at stake. And if the quest succeeds, which he made a condition of giving her hand in marriage to Aragorn, then she will choose to become human and she will die. And not only will he be sundered from her in this life, but in the next as well. Like they will be separated forever.
Hmm.
And he still makes the right choice. So I'd hate to be in his shoes.
Yeah, I sure would. Interesting.
That's just one of the things I find gripping about Tolkien. I mean, he had I mean, he knew human nature. He is one of the
Mm.
masters of human nature in literature. I mean, he went
Mm.
to war. He saw what people are capable of. And he was also a devout Catholic, so he saw what God is capable of. Just the subtle ways that he has grace just permeate the entire story. It's really never been equaled.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, very interesting. To give an example of a virtue versus virtue, which I too concur. I also concur that is very underrated. But I think it's underrated largely because it's more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Because choosing between two goods requires wisdom. Um, so I don't know if you read my blog post um, on the on choosing between two competing goods. And the problem, of course, with because choosing between competing goods like justice and compassion, for example, both of which are good. That to now those are a little bit iffy because it is possible, given the overabundance of God, to satiate justice and go further into mercy. So they're not quite always strict competitors, but something like say um, justice and truth, for example. Do you do you satisfy because you can set it up such that these two, given the circumstances, you can't have quite both. That
For
to
sure.
and so the what to do in these circumstances requires wisdom. And the problem is wisdom being a type of knowledge, you can't fake knowledge. And you can fake a lot of things. You can fake moral virtue. That's relatively easy. I mean, you can fake courage in a character. A cowardly author can write very courageous characters because all he has to do is have them, make choices that he himself would never make in their position. But you can't imbue somebody with knowledge that you don't have because, well, you can't give what you haven't got.
Mm-hmm.
And which brings up a very interesting thing. I presume you've read Screwtape Letters?
Yes.
There's a very interesting introduction to the Screwtape Letters that Lewis had, and I think it may be a second introduction, but where he talks about how the Screwtape Letters are very incomplete because they're only one half of it. They're only from Screwtape to Wormwood, advising Wormwood on how to try to corrupt the patient.
Okay, I think I remember you writing about this. Yeah, it's going.
Okay, and so to keep the recap brief, he said, and really, to make this book, to write the other half of this book, there should be letters from some archangel to the guardian angel of the patient, advising him. But the problem was, well, Lewis could do a decent job of aping a devil giving advice. It would take a perfect man to write the letters of a perfect being, and even more than that, the beauty of expression would just be part of the wisdom and knowledge and perfection built in, and that he's very much not the equal of that. And so it strikes me this is a problem, especially we have the stereotype of the tortured artist, largely tortured because he's morally corrupt, and it that it imposes a very, very great limitation that a man who has no wisdom can't write any wisdom into his characters. And so I personally think this may go a long way towards explaining why we have so much of this idea of good characters are flawed characters. Because of course, if you only have a simple choice between good and evil, like, do I shoot this innocent person or do I not shoot this innocent person? I won't. Well, good for that character. And, in real life, will I, part with my sandwich to feed this homeless person? Well, yeah, it's good for you, but that's kind of between you and God. And it's not very interesting because, the answer to what you should do is really kind of blindingly obvious. And the question of, will you or won't you is kind of only relevant to real people, not as much to fictional. So there's nothing I think there to hook the interest, and consequently, the flawed character of how do they navigate their flaws, I think becomes something that's available to, even a fool can write a character like that. So to turn this into something of a question rather than just sort of rehearsing a blog post of mine from memory, which I apologize for having done. Where do you see the in terms of writing, and this could even be advice, because there are, as you know, lots of people who would love to write professionally. Where do you see the relationship of wisdom to writing interesting stories?
It's often said to write what you know, wisdom being a species of knowledge. And a lot of aspiring writers take that the wrong way as a negative, to think that, oh, well, I've never been an equestrian, I don't know anything about horsemanship, so I'm not going to ride horses. Which Brandon Sanderson partially agree with, because he said no one gets on your case like the horse people. If you get the littlest thing wrong, you'll start getting your emails from the horse people. A horse is not a motorcycle. You don't just tie it up in front of a store and leave it all night. So I think he's got one book because of that, where everyone travels by canoe the whole time. But that's not what the advice means. I think the advice means more along the lines of what you're saying, which is that you have to write with wisdom, that you really can't fake it because your readers will know. So try to imagine if someone like George R. Martin or Michael Moorcock attempted to write Lord of the Rings. I mean, it would be a mess. It would, because they just couldn't. They couldn't get the moral They couldn't get the moral center right, and if they tried, the characters' actions would just look nonsensical because the characters would come off as not knowing why they're doing what they're doing, because the authors don't, they would seem just like automatons or puppets. So wisdom, as in all things, is vitally important.
So advice for aspiring authors is read more Chesterton and Aquinas.
Well, advice for anyone is read those guys, but yeah, do your research.
And do your moral research as well as your physical research. Yes. An interesting example of this actually comes to mind now. My own opinion is that of all the villains I've ever read, Iago from Othello is the greatest of all the villains. In particular, because he's the best moral philosopher of any villain I've ever encountered. And the wonderful scene where he tricks Othello into demanding that he tell his suspicions about Desdemona and the name's escaping me. But anyway, the young man who was promoted ahead of Iago, and Iago was jealous of and trying to destroy.
I don't know, because I have not read Othello and I've only seen parts of it. So I'm going to have to bow out on that one. You're on your own.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, so that's the setup. And so there's this wonderful, amazing scene where he sort of obliquely refers to the fact that he has some suspicions to Othello, and then Othello becomes curious, and then he tells Othello that that he won't give voice to his suspicions, and this is where the speech where he gives about beware my lord of jealousy, it is the green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds on. But another part in this conversation, Othello's saying, I will know your thoughts, and he's saying, but what if my thoughts are false and wicked? It would be terrible for me to tell you them, to give a suspicion, which when I plant the seed would be very hard for you to get rid of. And Othello, is coming after him. And one of the best lines, when he said, tell me what you know. Iago says, I am not bound to all that slaves are free to. Meaning that as a free man, he is not required by duty to actually do what Othello orders him to in this context. In a military matter, he would, because he's under Othello's command. But here, in peacetime, he's not bound to follow any such order. And because he's not bound to follow any such order, he should instead follow his conscience. And so that wonderful line, I am not bound to all that slaves are free to. And there's so much rich moral philosophy in Iago's speeches as he tricks Othello into demanding that Iago poison his mind against his wife, poison Othello's mind against his wife. Iago is absolutely brilliant, and all of his moral philosophy is spot on accurate, which is one of the other things that makes him one of the most curious and strange and fascinating of the villains, is that he knows what he is doing is wrong. He can explain it. He actually, in fact, does explain it at some length and detail, and very, very accurately, exactly why what he's doing is really, really wrong. And you don't get that very often. You don't get a villain who can actually, we've got so much of this idea of villains essentially misunderstood heroes, at least in their own mind, that we don't have much of villains who, have the honesty to see themselves as villains.
Yeah, and again, that is diabolical. And all I could think of was that the devil can quote scripture for his own purposes. Can twist moral philosophy for his own purposes.
Yeah, it's a great example of it, and it's really well done, and also goes to show because, Shakespeare himself was very obviously a genius in several senses of the word, because he puts in such amazingly good things in so many places. Just rich things in so many places. But it's funny too. Just speaking about honest villains, because there's this idea that I think cardboard cutouts get a bad rap, because the thing about a cardboard cutout is that because the author is not giving it depth, the depth of the character is not limited in a cardboard cutout. if you're not giving any backstory, if you're not explaining a villain's motivations, they could be anything. Whereas when when an author tries to flesh out the villain, if he doesn't do a very good job, he's drawn very narrow limits to how deep the villain actually might be. And I think we get a lot of very shallow villains these days. And one of the things is since so many of them are essentially, everyone goes the same route these days, and misunderstood. They think of themselves at least as misunderstood good guys. That we're sorely lacking in villains who have the clarity of thinking to realize that they're actually doing something wrong. I actually I have no idea what scene I'm going to do it in, but I just really want someday I'm going to write a scene wherein the villain is talking with like an underling who's questioning him and trying to understand, like, why are you doing this? And keeps asking, and the villain keeps explaining, no, I'm not doing this secretly to save somebody or other. No, it's not, in order to preserve this sort of justice and so on. And eventually, as it keeps on trying, as the underling keeps on trying to, make this out to actually be morally good and just misunderstood, and the villain keeps saying, no, that's not actually why I'm doing it. Eventually saying, look, I can't give you a good explanation for a bad decision.
That's a great line.
Someday I feel free to steal it too, of course, but someday I'll figure out some scene to use it in.
Careful who you say that to.
Yeah, I mean, heaven knows if I'll ever get to use it. But villains like that, I think, villains who actually have some clarity and understand themselves to have actually made mistakes is something, at least, I'm citing a 400-year-old example, granted from one of the great storytellers of all time. Can you think of anybody like that in recent memory? Honest villains?
I have been racking my mind while you've been talking, trying to think of this. And at first I thought of Darth Vader, but no, he's an ideologue who believes he's bringing peace to the galaxy. Even he is probably deludedly thinking that what he's doing is necessary to bring about some good. So,
well, and
no,
then
he doesn't
Timothy
admit he was
Zahn
wrong.
went and really, in a sense, wrecked that one by introducing the super powerful alien from another galaxy that their galaxy needed to be united to stand a chance of not being wiped out with. Are you familiar with that? I only read the Heir to the Empire series by Timothy Zahn. Excellent books.
Oh, excellent. That's what should have been episodes 7, 8, 9. They should have made it like in the mid-90s and just not done them. Special editions, I would have been happy. But yeah, are you talking about the Yuuzhan Vong from the New Jedi Order?
Yes, I think I am. I haven't actually read the books. Okay. Friends who told me about it.
I read the first two. First one's by Bob Salvatore. It's pretty good. It actually takes some risks in it. And then the second one, I just found the quality fell off a cliff, so I stopped. But yeah, if that's the case, if they try to whitewash the New Order, the Empire, as having been the only way, like a necessary good to survive the Yuuzhan Vong, yeah, exactly like you said, that's just a cop-out.
That's what I heard that they eventually did. That was revealed to have been the actual reason, reasoning behind the, why the Emperor was trying to unite everybody in one giant empire, which, ironically enough, is actually to some degree the plot of a book you never ever read in the Dragonlance series is Dragons of Summer Flame. My friend and I, who are great fans of it, alternately refer to it as Dragons of Summer Suck and Dragons of Didn't Actually Happen, because we both like to pretend it was because I mean, picture this, we both read this as the originals as teenagers, and they're really good, and we love them. And then around the time we were 16, 17, somewhere in that range, Dragons of Summer Flame comes out. We went years with nothing, and then here's another book written by the original authors, Weiss and Hickman. And I can remember the day I finished it, the day I got it. I had to wait until my parents were asleep, and my bedroom was literally across the hall from theirs, and then be certain they were definitely asleep, and they went to bed later than I did. And then I had to get my copy of the book, and then my mother especially was a light sleeper, so I crept into the bathroom, closed the door, taking a full, half minute to get it closed so no sound would come out, then put a towel along the crack at the bottom just so no light would come out, And then, I spent the next several hours like leaning against the bathtub reading this thing. So with that much invested in it, the amount of disappointment when it sucked terribly was, I think, amplified. But ironically, the relation being, what they decided was that they would, the god of good decided that they would throw the battle with the god of evil because they needed everyone to be united because there was a chaos, the father of the gods, who was sort of like the real god of evil since he abhorred all form and order. Their moral philosophy was not very good. So the god of good would, Paladine would throw the battle with Takesis so that she would dominate everything and unite the world in order to be able to fight chaos. And man, did that story suck.
Yeah.
So do you think we could take as a lesson from this that stories in which evil empires dominate the world in order to save it from a yet greater evil are probably predestined to suck?
Let's see. I don't know if I'm willing to go that far because my favorite sci-fi novel is Dune, and
I haven't read it. So you'll have to...
Okay, that almost exactly describes what happens, which is that. Do you mind spoilers? I mean, it is like a 60-year-old book at this point.
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty fair to say that let's say, okay, spoilers are coming, so anyone who hasn't read it, I don't mind spoilers in the slightest. I generally can appreciate things just as well.
Okay, good.
The spoilers. I'm a big reader, so that may play into it. So, okay, so we've warned anybody who could possibly be injured by it. So go ahead.
Okay. So with Dune, it takes place thousands and thousands of years in the future. And really religion and the power of religion as a social force is a major theme of the whole series. And one of the opening conceits of the book is that at some point in the past, there was this universal sort of super ecumenical interfaith council that really tried to syncretistic synthesis of all human religion, try to boil down what are the essentials, what are things that all religions agree upon, and they talk about just how fraught it was. And like one of the council fathers like flew a ship into the sun and committed suicide because he couldn't take it anymore. But they came up with a document called the Orange Catholic Bible, which is just Catholic in the small c universal sense. This is supposed to be, mankind's religion. And they came up with like one overriding commandment, which is thou shalt not disfigure the soul. But
not bad advice.
No, it's not bad advice. Herbert's actually really good when it comes to like dealing with theology and ecclesiology and moral philosophy. But what ends up happening is that there are a few orders that are founded in the intervening years having to do with the advent of space travel. Because one thing that happens is artificial intelligence is outlawed. Another commandment is thou shalt not make a machine for the likeness of a human mind. So they're limited, like, very simple, like mechanical calculators and things. But so instead, they develop and train orders of humans to pick up the slack so they can make the incredibly complex calculations needed to fold space and like not fold into a sun or black hole or something and arrive at the right place in time. So there are these competing orders that all deal with very high level math and deal with developing the human brain to outperform any processor we have today. And one of the key things that makes this possible is this drug called melange, or the spice, which is found only on the planet Arrakis, nicknamed Dune because it's one vast global desert. And the spice is an extract of the giant sandworms that live there. That is created as part of their life cycle when they go from like the adolescent stage to the adult stage. So it's very rare, but it dramatically boosts human cognitive ability, dramatically expands human lifespans out to like 200-300 years. And it's more addictive than crack, and withdrawal is 100% fatal. So I figure that these orders that are basically the calculation backbone of society need this stuff. Most of the nobility and upper crust and merchants are addicted to it for the longevity and health effects. And that's what leads to the maxim: he who controls the spice controls the universe. It's very much true.
And by the way, one of these, it's got a layered effect, right? Because that is to say, like, a little bit of it will give you the health benefits, and you need a lot of it in order to get the sort of super genius levels.
Oh yeah, I mean, it admits of degrees, definitely. Like, you can mix it in your coffee, or like even bake it into a pie or something, or just take it raw. You'll get like a little buzz, and it'll be like a super vitamin supplement or something. But yeah,
because I've seen clips from the movies, and because I believe that's not faithful to the book, but wasn't there one order who like practically just like breathed this stuff or swam in the stuff or something?
Yeah, that's a spacing guild, yeah.
Okay, yeah. In the movie, it was depicted as like a giant worm-like thing in a tank. Or
that is taking liberties, but yeah, basically, that wasn't done with one dose. That's because that guy was a third stage guild navigator who came from a long line, who had all of his forefathers had been addicted to the spice and used massive quantities of it. So it was a genetic mutation as a result of generations and generations of using this stuff.
But basically, there were some people who would use what was, in a day, what would be a lifetime supply for a more casual user.
Well, what it is the Bene Gesserit order, who's an all-female order that runs a breeding program trying to bring about what they call the Kwisatz Haderach, or I believe basically means the shortcut. And they're trying to create the Superman, the next step in human evolution.
Shortcuts are always a problem.
Oh, and how? And that's really the main theme of the first book, because their little experiment gets away from them, and that's Paul Atreides. But yeah, their final sort of graduation ceremony to create what's called a Reverend Mother, which is the highest degree of their order, is to not just take a dose of the spice, but what's called the water of life, which is spice concentrate. It is the bile that results from drowning a baby sandworm in water. And remember, water is toxic to the sandworms. So like what normally happens when a spice is produced is a bunch of what is called sand trout, or the second life stage of the worms, because the worms start out as tiny little spores in the sand, like plankton almost. And they seek out like tiny droplets, like single drops of water in the sand, and create a cyst around it. And that grows and forms a sand trout, which is probably about the size of your hand. And then those seek out bigger sources of water and surround it, and go through this metamorphosis into a sandworm. But then after that, the worms never touch water because it's toxic to them. But when a baby sandworm is created from a sand trout cyst, there's a spice blow where the cyst ruptures, and the new worm and spice come out and blow through the sand. And then they come and like scoop it up from first few layers of sand. But if you drown a sandworm in water, it coughs up this blue bile that is just super hyper concentrated spice, which is so toxic that like a half a drop will kill a grown man dead instantly. Like it's one of those toxic substances in the universe. It is a poison. And so the Reverend Mother test is, okay, drink some of this stuff. And because the Bene Gesserit learn like cellular control of their metabolisms, you don't do this. You don't take this test unless you are constantly sure in your ability to metabolize poisons, because you've got to use your body to turn the water of life into spice.
Interesting.
Yeah, and if you can do it, then it dramatically increases your intellect. It gives you access to your genetic memories going like all the way back.
Interesting.
But yeah, a conceit is the Reverend Mothers are limited to only seeing the female line. They can only like read the X chromosome.
Huh.
Because there's this Lamarckian evolution thing going on where memories are stored, like the lived memories of an individual are stored in his genes, and then when he has offspring, the offspring doesn't know, but he inherits all the genetically stored memories, of his father and mother up to the point where he was conceived, going all the way back. And the Bene Gesserit can only see the female half of humanity, And the Kwisatz Haderach is basically, they define it as a male Reverend Mother. But so far, no man has been able to survive. Yeah.
Oh,
So like,
very interesting.
There have been plenty of men before Dune starts who have tried, but they all die horrible, painful deaths from taking the spice concentrate. So Paul Atreides, the main character of the book, is, spoiler alert, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just a quick thing. It's interesting in a sense, a very Christian theme. You see this in a bunch of, I've seen this in a number of places. The idea where the entrance into power is something, is some sort of poison, essentially. That the the entrance.
It's a baptism motif.
Sorry, what?
It's a baptism motif if you think about it.
It is. It's a baptism motif, and it's also, there are also echoes of the nature of. Well, actually, speaking of baptism, when the Sons of Thunder, the twins, asked Jesus, "Can we sit at your right hand, your left?" And he said, "Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I will be baptized?"
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "We can." He said, "So you will, but for who sits at my right, my left, it's not mine to give." Mm-hmm. That scene, but what he's referring to, of course, was his crucifixion,
right?
That his in that sense, his entrance into power was through. Well, actually, literally through dying, and actually, really taking it to the extreme. You have that when he describes in the Gospel of John, I have the power to lay down my life and the power to take it up again.
Well, just wait to see where this is going, because Herbert was acutely aware of that. He knew exactly what he was doing. That is what he was going for. Because in the book, Paul tries it. He takes the smallest drop of the water of life and goes into a coma for about 2 weeks. And he barely makes it. And in fact, some people think he is dead. He goes away and doesn't tell anyone where he's going, if I remember correctly. But yeah, he does succeed, and gets access to the male half of the genetic lineage. But it happens early, because really what the Bene Gesserit had planned, according to their thousands of years long breeding program, was to marry Paul to a daughter of the Atreides family's mortal enemies, House Harkonnen. And they'd expected, well, really, Paul was supposed to be a girl. His mother, Jessica, who is a Bene Gesserit, defied her order and had a son. Because again, they have total cellular control. They can choose what sex their child's going to be. And because she loved her husband, the Duke Leto Atreides, she gave him a son. When the breeding program said that, well, we want you to have a daughter and marry her to a Harkonnen male, and that'll lead us to the Kwisatz Haderach, and the Kwisatz Haderach ends up coming a generation early in Paul.
Interesting.
Yeah, throwing off the Sisterhood's plans is because of love.
Interesting.
But then what he goes and does with it, though, is he rallies this hardcore group of desert warriors called the Fremen, who make their home on Arrakis and have learned how to survive there. And they have this dream of one day terraforming the planet into a green paradise. And part of where this dream came from was the Bene Gesserit have what's called the Missionaria Protectiva, where they have actually seeded sacred documents with sort of coded, hidden, what to call it. But it's basically so that if a Reverend Mother winds up kind of stranded on a planet that has been, proselytized to by their order, she can make use of certain lines and certain exegesis from these documents to ingratiate herself to the locals. And so what Paul is able to do with that knowledge is become their Messiah.
Interesting.
Yeah, because they have a messianic prophecy, again, brought to them by their own Reverend Mothers, that Paul fulfills.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they name him Muad'Dib, and they follow him and help him to become emperor of the known universe. And in the second book, they point out the price of this, which is he kills billions of people. Like, he sterilizes whole worlds. But it's kind of because he knows he's not totally controlled. He cannot order around every single one, like his millions of followers. And they've been cooped up on this planet so long that they have to kind of go out and really just pillage, because it would be worse if he didn't give them that outlet. Like, they even compared him to Hitler at one point. And one, like, his chief lieutenant says, "Oh, I studied that Hitler guy. He only, conquered parts of Europe, and you have conquered hundreds of worlds and sterilized dozens, and you're a way better military. You're way more military successful than he was." And Paul's like, "That's not really a compliment, guy." But so he's kind of set this machine in motion, but it's out of control. And he knows it, and he knew this was going to happen because he can also see the future. He's prescient. And part of the plot of the first book is him being faced with diverging paths where, okay, if I make this choice, this is where it's going to go. Me and my mom are going to die, but then this won't happen. And he basically sees humanity's end in stagnation. And it leads to what's called the Golden Path, which is this horrific sacrifice that a leader with prescience would have to make to see to it that humanity continues on longer than this dead end that he sees society degenerating to. And tellingly, Paul can't do it. So he turns aside from that, leaves it to his son, Leto II, who does succeed at this. So, yeah, in Dune, it's not necessarily an evil empire. I mean, it's called a jihad. It does a lot of evil things, but it is specifically said it's the only way that mankind would not be totally wiped out. Long story short.
Interesting.
Yeah, I highly recommend you picking up. I think it'd be up your alley. If you might not necessarily agree with Herbert's view of religion, he is a writer with wisdom. He does know what he's talking about.
Interesting. It does sound very interesting. It's funny, actually, Russell Newquist recently on Twitter had posted something about, if you haven't read Dune, what's wrong with you? To which I responded, well, lots of things, actually. But aiming slightly for that spirit of in Chesterton, some newspaper author, newspaper editor had, published a contest for, what's wrong with the world. And he responded, "Dear sirs, I am sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." Yeah, we all have our faults. It does sound very, very interesting. And, it's really, it also strikes me as very interesting, the baptism motif. Because it's something actually in two unrelated plot lines that I've thought of that I will develop someday. One of them actually about plot line where I want to develop the idea of holy vampires, where there's actually vampires who essentially can come out in the daylight, but there's actually a ceremony specifically where they receive communion at high noon and then burn horribly in the sunlight. But if it works and they survive, they become the order of holy vampires, who then fight the evil ones.
That's a synchronicity, because I've actually written a short story, sort of on the opposite of those lines. But I wrote a short story. It's available for free on my blog, called "Is Cacus," dealing with my take on vampires, and it's actually a response to a wager that a horror fiction friend of mine made, where he had quoted one of his film professors who had said, there are only two types of vampires. There's the religious vampires and the scientific vampires. They're either caused by like some sort of demon infestation or curse, or they're caused by a virus or nanotech or something, and never the twain shall meet. You can't have both. So it was my attempt to bridge the gap. I'll leave it to your viewers to decide whether I succeeded or not. But I went back and did a lot of research on the original vampire folklore. And really what they are is they're anti-Eucharistic. That's what the vampire is, at least in the Western canon, at heart, is how Satan can't do sacramentality. Obviously, he is a limited being, but he can, cast the shadow. He can warp what is good and turn it away from its true end. So, whereas the Eucharist is where we take the medicine of eternal life by eating the flesh and drinking the blood of Christ, which does not diminish him. It's not cannibalism, because cannibalism involves taking something away from the victim. The Eucharist is it's an eternal sacrifice that is just made present to us on the altar again and again. Vampirism is cannibalism that doesn't grant eternal life. It artificially and unnaturally extends out this vestige of mortal life, and it reduces one to a wretched, dependent state on having to feast on one's fellow man.
Interesting. Bram Stoker's, in Dracula by Bram Stoker, it's very telling. I think people made it much simpler and it actually got away from the sort of faux sacramentality of it. But the way a vampire was made, as I'm sure you know, but the blood baptism of the vampire, where Dracula would drink. Was it Nina Harker's that he turned?
First he turned Lucy.
Lucy.
But yeah, then he started turning Nina. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, with Lucy, when he turned her, that he drank her blood and then he cut himself and held her mouth against his cut and forced her to drink her blood back again, filtered through his corrupt body. And it was referred to as the blood baptism of the vampire. Right? It was the blood baptism of the vampire?
It's been years since I've read it, but that sounds about right.
Yeah, but it's very fascinating, the sort of aping of sacramentality in this. That I think really it works very well with exactly what you're just, it seems to be exactly what you're describing. I mean,
and in terms of the secondary world mechanic, I very much do like your idea of sort of baptizing the vampire himself through that means of consuming sacred host at noon, and if he survives, then he's transformed. That's brilliant.
Yeah, it was specifically to be essentially underground, that he would be given the Eucharist and then walk out into the noon sun and be burned and go into a coma, but if he wakes up from it.
Yeah, that's I can just see that scene playing out. They makes for a lot of dramatic tension. It's
it's also how there are very few who there are few who try it and fewer who survive. But forming a small core, against essentially a larger foe. Very themes. There's another one in a completely different direction of magic, essentially magic using warrior mages. Completely, utterly different universe, but essentially, a training that there's a special crystal sword that they form that essentially the crystal acts as channels of power that they use and so on, but that each one must forge their own. But the thing is vastly more powerful than a novice could ever do. So that there's a ceremony, once they've trained enough to get to the sort of the stage where they're ready, there's a ceremony where there's a very particular snake where they have it bite them. And the venom causes, the venom massively magnifies your ability to control the magical power. So in the few hours you have to live, what you do is you forge your sword. That has to be forged by you using all the magic necessary to forge your sword, and then hopefully, if you've finished before you're dead, you then, as sort of your final act, use the magic to create an antidote to the venom. And of course, your body having been exposed to it, it will now become immune to it. So a second bite won't do anything. But you will, in this process, if again you survive this, you will then have the sword that allows you to focus the power and progress and into higher levels of magical power. And I hadn't really thought of I thought of both of them independently of each other, and I hadn't really thought of them in that sort of baptismal sense. The vampire one a little bit more, but it's both of those really. And I do apologize. Talking about stories one hasn't written can be a terrible habit, because they're so vivid to oneself and do such a poor job describing them. So I apologize for having just done that twice in a row.
Just make sure to write it down.
But anyhow, so but it does, especially to me, strike me very vividly your description of the baptismal motif and just how powerful the baptismal motif is as a story, just how utterly fascinating it can be. That entrance into power through something that will probably kill you but might not.
Absolutely. That's why writers have been using it for thousands of years, even before Christianity, because of course the ritual baptism was known to the ancient Hebrews when John the Baptist was baptizing before the church was founded. There are water purification rituals in all cultures, and really baptism is a death and resurrection metaphor, because in the ancient world, think of what the sea meant. It was terrifying, because people knew that, well, sometimes people go out on boats, sometimes they don't come back. So that's incidentally one of the conceits I like about Larry Correa's Son of the Black Sword, which is the ocean is literally hell. I mean, much like in Soul Cycle, although taken to a far higher degree, the government is officially atheist, to the point of actually persecuting the religious, but they still just call the ocean hell. Because demons actually live there, and sometimes they come out and eat people. But that very much is in line with the ancient reckoning of things. So baptism has always been recognized as a symbol. Again, not just a sign, but something that brings about what it signifies: dying and then rising to life and power, as you said.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Calls to mind too. I don't know if it would be or not, just off the top of my head. Achilles, where he,
dipped in these. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah. Just I was going to say what you said, when he was dipped in and he gained his invulnerability from. Was it Hydra's blood?
I thought it was the river Styx, and his mother held him by his ankle, and that's why his heel was his weak point.
Right. Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah. That's right. The river Styx. So there's something, but especially I think in the Christian motif, I think adds the suffering element. That the idea of power and suffering, again, it being true, you will find echoes of this throughout human experience. So there's a point I loved. C.S. Lewis made it. I think he talked about the Corn King, but Chesterton made it too. That the thing about true things is they echo throughout life. So you expect, if something's really a true facet of reality, you really do expect to see echoes of it everywhere.
Well, sure. I mean, we have a common human nature. That's why when one of the most curious things to me about the enemies of the Catholic Church is when they point out that something like a Christmas tree or Easter egg is a holdover from paganism. Well, first of all, there are good arguments that they're actually not. But even if they were, well, there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that if you baptize them. As John C. Wright likes to say, he likes to say that the muses were baptized, and now they serve Christian writers as well.
I like that. It was something. Have you read Chesterton's The Dumb Ox?
No.
His biography of St. Thomas. Okay, let me recommend that very strongly. It is an excellent.
I'll write it down.
Excellent book. Yeah, here. Let me.
Intermission.
Here. Sorry. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, it is. I've read it, I don't know, 4 or 5 times now. I actually have to hand Orthodoxy, which I've read getting on 20. But anyhow, the Dumb Ox, fabulous book. But one of the things he mentions is a metaphor, not original to Chesterton, but about how St. Thomas was said to have baptized Aristotle. And Chesterton used the metaphor that in a sense he was Aristotle's godfather.
Right. Well, and taking this to another level, in medieval art, you can find examples of Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle with square halos.
That's awesome.
And so, well, again, is it justified to call them Saint Socrates, Saint Plato, Saint Aristotle? Well, we can hope.
Indeed,
I mean, Yeah, Cardinal Newman thought that there must have been a dispensation made for them because again, they're obviously good men, not just that, holy men. And how they constantly have how they conducted themselves, and look at how their philosophy. Look how much good it's brought about. So.
Yeah, wasn't there someone who called Plato Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the things they taught, the proto-evangelion?
Yes.
Yeah, there's another one too, and I can't remember. I encountered this oddly enough in a footnote when I was reading. I'm only about halfway through the City of God. Uh, um, like everything is kind of put on the side at the moment, but there's some, not quite a church father, a little bit later, but who referred to Plato as, what is Plato but Moses in Attic Greek?
Oh.
And I can't remember who it is. It's not one of the big names. It's one of the smaller names.
I do not know.
Yeah, I can't. If you follow Eve Kaninen on Twitter, she's posted a card quoting him 2 or 3 times now.
Okay, I missed that somehow, but yeah, I follow Eve.
Anyway, well, she posts a lot, but yeah. Anyway, so it's yeah, in terms of the echoes and so on. But there is something I think Christianity does add, at least in its emphasis on the power obtained through suffering. And I mean, you can see, again, you can see echoes of it, but really, I think it brings to the forefront that well, like many things, it said that Christianity baptized suffering. That it took.
Right.
Who was it who put it that it's not that God got rid of our suffering, but that He made it useful.
Yes, and that's what Christianity adds, is that Christianity provides the only satisfying, internally consistent, coherent answer to the problem of suffering, to the problem of pain. Because yeah, it is that, again, using secondary causes, God can use us and our suffering as a secondary cause to bring about salvation for ourselves and others, or actually put in a position where we can mediate salvation to other people, which is an awesome responsibility, but also an awesome gift. So we can be co-redeemers. We're called to do that.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, it's interesting. It's sort of a theological point, but it's the because I mean, justice. It's the way in which justice, that God can simultaneously satisfy justice and mercy by on the one hand, by using suffering in this way, by elevating suffering, it becomes possible with suffering to satisfy justice. But because suffering is offered up, it can be offered up by one who can survive it. And thus, it is possible to satisfy justice such that mercy can then be given without violating justice.
Right. And that, I think, speaking of God's omnipotence, that's a far better example. Because again, there are people who both try to illustrate or even attack the concept of, with the old, well, could God create a rock so big even He couldn't lift it? And what they're missing, of course, is forms and natures, and the fact that, well, no, because it is not in God's nature to do that. And being all powerful doesn't mean that one can do anything, but the one is not limited in the powers proper to one's nature. So God isn't interested in creating a rock so big He couldn't lift it. What He is interested in, clearly, is stuff like, well, how do I satisfy perfect justice and superabundant mercy at the same time? How do I coordinate my sovereign, invincible will with human freedom? And it would take an all-powerful being to do that. It's not that God's omnipotence necessarily cancels out human free will. That'd actually be a limitation on God. But God is so powerful that He can exercise His omnipotence, and we can have our freedom at the same time. And I think that is the real proof, the real test of being all powerful, and it's closer to the real meaning.
Relatedly, there's a great line St. Augustine had, and it is a letter to a monastery. There's some monks who were arguing free will versus grace. And St. Augustine wrote a letter answering this, coming down decidedly on both sides. And well, he did. It's the only way to describe it.
Right.
And I mean, there's some great parts where he talked about, like, on the free will side, the scriptures would be utter nonsense if there's no such thing as free will. And any interpretation of scripture that makes it pure raving nonsense can't be a good interpretation. And on the, I mean, grace is obvious, of course, all is grace. But one of the monks, or some of the monks, had brought up the foreknowledge of God. And, and they were trying to resolve it that, if God knows the choices that men make before they make them, obviously man can't actually be making a choice. It has to be for, the outcome has to be deterministic. And St. Augustine had this wonderful line that if God knows the choices in the future, or if God knows the choices that men will make, it is not nothing that God knows. I've always loved that when he sort of, these people who are trying to defend God. Sorry, what?
No, I just an exuberant outpouring of affection for St. Augustine. That thesis be going.
Yeah, I just love how he turned. The people who are trying to defend God, he just turned it on its head. Actually, speaking of which, have you read Chesterton's introduction to the Book of Job?
No.
Oh, it's only like 4 pages long.
Oh.
And I'll of course I'll post a link in the description. I'll send you one too. I personally think it's the best thing Chesterton's ever written.
Wow.
It may be more like 5 or 6 pages. It's not very long. But one of the things that's so fascinating is he points out in the Book of Job that it is the defenders of God who, in the end, come under criticism from God. That God praises Job in the end, but he condemns the people who defended him. And it ends where God tells them, and ask my servant Job to pray for you that my wrath will not descend upon you. So there's a fascinating thing that in a sense, defending God is a very perilous activity. Because God doesn't need any defense. And at least if you defend God in a human sense, in the sense of trying to protect God from people, that never ends well.
Absolutely. What's it saying? God doesn't need to be helped across the street like an old woman or something.
Yeah, I like that one. It's once again, I do recommend that thing by Chesterton. But so to bring this back though to writing, because I love theology, and I'm curious, by the way. Actually, yeah, this is a great way to bring it back to writing, because in my second book, A Stitch in Space, which is it actually was written because an atheist friend of mine said you should write a book about a priest in space. And I discovered when he said that one of the principles I live my life by is when an atheist friend tells me I should write a book about a priest in space, I do. Very oddly specific principle, much more so than the rest, but apparently is one. So I did. And so one of the things that followed, though, was that people talk to priests and priests talk about the faith. So the other thing is, since I find theology endlessly fascinating, I left out the parts where people use the bathroom, but I did include the parts where they're talking to the priest about theology and, the problems of life. And he mentioned how, theology solves the problems that, they're facing, even secular problems. And so I included a lot of that simply because I found it so incredibly interesting. And to some degree, I try the approach of write what I find interesting in the hope that someone else will as well, because if I write what I don't find interesting, what hope do I have anyone else will? Now it should be noted too that my sales are extremely small, but when you're writing, do you have this problem that and if you do, how do you avoid having very long almost academic theological discussions amongst characters?
There is precisely one philosophical discussion that verges on theology in ethereal. and it's actually between two characters who one's a reductionist, materialist, atheist, and it was a nihilist. And they actually get to talking about mechanical determinism, right, and the fate of the soul after death. And that's where one of them actually invokes that line, why, even worry about something, why posit something that there's no evidence for? Just don't worry about it. He just kind of hand waves it away. And the context is the agnostic materialist, a very Machiavellian character, is the nominal superior of the older, more nihilistic character. And the superior had ordered a raid on a pirate den, which resulted in many casualties on both sides. And I believe I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the casualties on their side were actually slightly higher. And the subordinate is saying, well, how can you consider that to be a good decision, to issue those orders? And the superior says, well, that's presuming I decided anything at all. Because, what's the mind? He's like, well, of course, it's a bunch of neurons are fired by chemicals. I'm like, okay, and what determines, how do the neurons know when to fire? How do the chemicals know what to do? Well, the laws of physics. Well, okay, then we can't really say that anyone in this whole situation could have acted otherwise, so don't worry about it.
A line I like, determinism means never having to say you're sorry, unless you have to.
Exactly. Yeah, it's beautiful. I did have my determinist character deliver the line when the first man says, well, so you believe in fate? And he says, well, I prefer determinism. So, yeah, Jadji told me that made share that to John, and he laughed out loud at that, so I consider that a job well done. But the question was, how do I kind of rein myself in? This might not be much help, but I just do. I edit exactingly, and I'm one of the few writers I know of who takes as much pleasure in editing as I do in composing. So I just love taking clunky, unnecessary words out of a sentence, and I love really just stripping whole scenes that are superfluous and don't need to be there, because ultimately I'm reader facing. I want the story to be as much fun for a reader as possible, and learning to be less self-indulgent was a hard lesson that I had to just drill into myself over years of alpha readers getting back to me and saying, well, there's a good story in there, but yeah, there really have to be 300,000 pages. You really need like this geological study and travelogue at the beginning. So it's just practice. It's just going out, getting feedback, learning what your readers want to read. But again, at the same time, an author has to cater to his audience, but an author's first audience member is always himself. So you've also got to make it interesting for you. So it's just a balance, and it takes time to find the balance.
Like virtually everything, the way you get good is by practicing.
Exactly. I mean, as Aristotle would say, well, how do you become a writer? Or when? Well, it's when you write. You were defined by what you do. It's not the other way around. It's not that you write because you're a writer. You are a writer because you write. So I've taken that to heart.
Yeah. It's although it's not quite self-indulgence, because there's. Oh, have you ever done NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month?
Attempted it once. But
okay, I did it a bunch of times. I found it very good practice.
Sure.
And then eventually used it to make a few first drafts, which I then spent a long time editing, expanding and other things afterwards and so on. But one of them, I had a story where I realized, like, partway through this story, I just didn't like any of these characters. I couldn't stand any of these people, so I kind of went, screw it. I mean, I still had at that point, I had like 30,000 words left to go. For those who don't know, it's write a 50,000 word first draft of a novel in the month of November. And so it had like 30,000 words to go, and I'm like, screw it. There's no way I'm ever turning this into a book. This is going nowhere. I don't like these characters. And so they suddenly all developed an interest in philosophy and theology. And like, it was just a collection at that point of philosophical conversations that were a ton of fun to write. In comparison to spending any more time with the characters as they had been up to that point.
I'll answer your question. I did try it. I did try it, but I actually I made it on time, but it wasn't to the prescribed length. It was like 10,000 words short, so I ended up with a novella instead of a novel, which doesn't count. Anyway, please continue.
Oh, anyway, so I was just saying, so in one sense, that would be self-indulgent if I ever thought to show this to anybody. Since I made the clear decision I was never going to show this to anybody, I figured, what the heck? At least it has the discipline, even the mechanical stuff. For some people, actually, this is a good writing question. The mechanical side, button share time, as some people call it, but like just actually making yourself write. Is that a skill that you had to spend much time learning, or did that part come relatively easily to you?
Oh, sure, that's a skill you have to learn. I find for me it's a subset of patience, which, being a virtue, is a skill. And for one thing, getting paid helps. That's a good inducement. But I'll admit, I don't write every day, at least not in fiction. I mean, I work on my blog and my social media. But at this point, being a pro writer, I really don't write without a contract. Like, I'm not going to write for free. So I found myself with some vacation time lately. Now that my third Soul Cycle novel is out, I plan to stagger it with another book I'm doing for someone else, and then get the fourth book out later this year. But in terms of practical advice for how to do it, it's just a discipline that you have to develop. It does take willpower, and really, piece of advice I found handy is that if you can not write, if it is possible for you not to write, don't do it. Do not do this. Don't get involved in this cycle of torment and self-flagellation and heartbreak unless you have no other choice. So as I said at the beginning, I really don't have any other choice, so I'm not sure if I'm the best guy to talk to. This is not a hobby for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, it's not a hobby. For me, it's part. I'm in about year 3 of my 20-year plan.
Okay. Well, if you've released stuff for sale, you're a professional writer. So congratulations.
Yeah. Well, I paid for the. So far, sales have paid for the cover on the first novel, and partway through paying for the cover on the second one. Okay. Although actually, my third, which is coming out soon, is a murder mystery, it's actually much more solidly within its genre. The first one was about superheroes, and it's a kind of an odd story. I liked it, but it kind of unconventional and not in like the groundbreaking sort of way, but more just the unconventional sort of way. But the related, and I did find NaNoWriMo very useful here. But I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm in the 20-year plan because I can earn my living through programming, which is what I do. And so I'm giving myself time because I do sort of compulsively come up with stories and tell stories and desperately want to write them down in a way that others can read. But I also am willing to spend a while, since I can, get the kids out and let them all be adults before I try making it go. And being patient gives one the time to build things up, which actually segues into a very good question. I think to wrap the conversation up on, since it does come naturally after the writing of the novel, is the promotion thereof. And I'm guessing, having an academic background, most people who do tend to be more on the introverted side, that self-promotion is an inescapable part of being an author these days, from what I gather. And so I'm curious, both, just some thoughts on that, how inescapable and how much self-promotion is involved, and how did you learn to do it? I mean, not the mechanics of promoting, but rather the ability to engage in the activity of self-promotion without feeling like you're doing something morally wrong.
I studied people who are good at self-promotion. So a couple books I could recommend: Platform by Michael Hyatt, spelled just like the hotel chain, who is also a deacon
Hmm.
in the Orthodox Church, I believe. But so, no danger of moral turpitude there. Also, I read Gorilla Mindset by Mike Cernovich, who's a controversial character. But what Mike does is he goes and he attends seminars by guys like Tony Robbins and reads like James Altucher. So, he consumes these advice seminars that cost sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, so you don't have to, and then sort of synthesizes them into his own brand and presents them as actionable advice. And there's a bit of moral relativism in there, but he's not trying to be a philosopher. So he says something like, well, there's my truth and your truth. I'm just giving you my truth. He means on a purely practical level, like, this might work for me. It won't necessarily work for you. So test everything and retain what's good.
Hmm. Yeah, I've noticed a lot of people, if they come near philosophy, the things they say would be terrifying if they actually meant them according to what the words say in that order, but they so very often don't.
Absolutely. So, but again, just following Mike in terms of his success, it's inarguable. I mean, the man built up a brand as an indie author, saw great success in the non-fiction market, which is even tougher than fiction, and still sells like an average of 50 books, 50 copies of his main one book a day. So he largely knows what he's doing. I did find that you can't just copy over his whole approach to fiction, because, for example, one of the things he says is, well, just get up, write 2,000 words, write a 2,000 word blog post every day, and then at the end of a year, you'll have enough for a book or more. Well, I haven't found a way to really apply that to fiction yet. A lot of it's sound.
I guess if you're writing a 1001 Arabian Nights style story.
Yeah, exactly. Another guy that I read a lot of, Joe Conrath, who publishes under J.A. Conrath. Fascinating guy from Chicago. Started out, busted his hump for like 10 years, trying to break into traditional publishing as a mystery writer. Finally succeeded. Spent almost his whole advance on his own dime, going on a multi-state tour where he would go to bookstores and just sign stock, because his publisher wouldn't send him on a tour where they gave him complimentary copies. So he had to go into a store where they had his books, just sign the store's copy of his books. He handed out and signed coasters he had printed up, crashed on fans' couches. He became a nonstop publicity, self-marketing machine, and got dropped because his publisher imprint got bought or something, and so they closed down their mystery line. So he suddenly found himself unemployed with a family to feed. So he tried to find another publisher for a fraction of what he made before, and still just busted his butt getting his name out there. And then finally saw that the PDF versions of his books that his fans had requested for him to put out there for their newfangled e-readers, because this was back in like 2006, 2007. And he said, sure, okay, I'll put them up there. Then he was really having people download a lot of them. And then the Kindle came out, people started saying, well, can you give us a Kindle version? And he found, well, the only way I can do that is to actually upload my book to KDP, and the minimum I can charge is 99 cents, because that's before Kindle Unlimited. He was like, sorry, guys, but yeah, if you really want an ebook version of my books, they're 99 cents. And then you turn on and was like, wow, gee, I'm a millionaire now. And he is, because he hit the sweet spot. He hit the gold rush days, but then he kept going through it, and Joe's a guy who really likes to experiment, so he'll try different prices, different project descriptions, different covers.
Mm.
So most of what I learned about the actual nuts and bolts of being a publisher, I learned from Joe, and then the rest from a guy named Dean Wesley Smith,
Mm.
who has a series on his blog you can read for free called Think Like a Publisher.
Mm.
And that's where I learned never to do things like give someone a percentage of royalties forever if they're just doing a one-time job like making a cover or doing an audiobook.
Mm.
Because again, you wouldn't give a plumber who's installing an extra bathroom in your house a share of ownership in your house. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. No, to be sure. Now, curious. Now, the did you by personality, did you have to overcome shyness to do this, or was that not an issue for you?
Well, I'm definitely an introvert. If you follow the Myers-Briggs scale, I'm an INFJ. So, and I think it's a misnomer that introverts are shy. It's just we prefer to spend more time meditating on and processing things. And it takes me more energy to engage with people, especially in person. So like an extrovert recharges his batteries like on mixing up, going to a party, engaging with people. I recharge my batteries through solitude.
Mm.
And it actually takes an expenditure of energy to go out and shake hands and rub elbows, but I can do it. It's a skill, it's a technical problem that admits of technical solutions. But yeah, it's really probably what kept me from attempting to publish earlier. But again, I'm not sure, like if I would have started 5-10 years earlier, I would be at the same level of success I am now because I still had to go through the old gatekeepers. And, again, being a straight white Catholic male who really can't keep his mouth shut, about the beauty of the gospel and theology. I don't know how long I would have lasted at a New York imprint. I mean, look at Nick Cole.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the whole the indie publishing revolution, it certainly has been quite a godsend, I think, in certain ways.
Amen. We're the only art sector, the only art industry that has managed a clean divorce from the gatekeepers. We're the only ones who are free to just interact with our audience directly.
Mm. Yeah, it's an amazing thing to watch unfold and to see it, because I mean we're still, I think, not necessarily in the very beginning stages, but certainly the early stages of seeing how this plays out, and seeing how society adapts to it and so on. So I guess a final thing, just in thinking like a publisher, pardon me.
No, let's talk about that. Let's talk about thinking like Frank Castle. Have a plan to kill everyone you meet.
Well, I get it related, but thinking like a publisher, how do you, in what manner do you figure out how to ruthlessly exploit yourself?
I wear two hats. I actually don't prefer the term self-published author. And yes, I do have a distaste for people who say, I prefer the term. Really, in this case, I think it's apt because I'm not a self-published author. I have two jobs. I'm an author, and then I'm also a publisher with one client who is me. So just like all writers have to have a delineation between composing mode and editing mode, right? You have your muse and your inner editor that kind of reins it in. It's very similar on the business front, where the author, muse, and artist, I'm creative. I'm there to make sure that my readers have fun. Well, as a publisher, it is my job to get what I've written in front of that audience. Okay. And in terms of the moral dimension, well, I don't find it to be that hard. It's just you don't lie to people. You don't cheat people. You don't gouge people like the big publishers do, charging paperback or sometimes even hardcover prices for an ebook that costs almost nothing to produce.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Occasionally with $1 or $2 discount, just because they know there'd be too much of it. At least one gets the impression they know there'd be too much of a revolt if they actually charge literally the same price.
Well, what they're actually trying to do is, or they did try a couple of years ago, is they tried to depress the ebook market, and they tried to kind of strangle Kindle in the cradle,
Mm.
and it didn't work.
That's right. Didn't
Because
Amazon have to take them to court or something like that?
there were a couple of court cases. One was Apple and the big five publishers were part of a class action lawsuit over price fixing that they
That's right.
lost. And Amazon had around a very fraught negotiations with Hachette Group, one of the big five,
Mm. That's right. I
over
remember
going
this now.
from agency pricing to like the wholesale model.
Mm.
I believe it's basically just whether the price is set by the publisher or the retailer, in this case being Amazon. And Hachette got Amazon to agree to let Hachette set the price of the books again, even though Amazon told them, well, look, we've got the algorithms and the sales figures. We know what the optimal price point for an ebook is. That is why, for example, we offer a 70% royalty on books between like $2.99 and $9.99. That's the sweet spot. Well, Hachette got the power to set pricing back promptly so the price is above $10. And then cue articles in Publishers Weekly saying that, oh, ebooks really were just a fad. Ebook sales are down. Well, no, they're only down for the big five publishers who overcharge. If you look at the pie as a whole, ebooks are growing.
Mm.
Amazon themselves, who know, say that ebooks continue to grow.
Mm. By the way, wasn't there some short-term period where they actually tried to make the ebook more expensive, claiming there was some additional value, like add a few special features or something, and actually charge more for the ebook? Wasn't that a short experiment?
Sure. I'm sure they tried any number of things. This gets back to not lying to or misrepresenting yourself to your audience, because here's the dirty open secret in mainstream publishing. The big five publishers do not sell books. They're not in the book business, because a book is an intangible good. It's made of ideas. They're in the lumber business. Seriously, the one thing they control is they block on a paper distribution channel through bookstores, especially Barnes & Noble and Books A Million, which I think are the only two big bookstore chains left. And the big five are charging too much for ebooks. Originally, they did it in a vain attempt to force readers back to paper, which was never going to work. That is just a paradigm shift that is happening with or without them. If they were smart, they would have invented the Kindle instead of having an online retailer do it. Just like Sony or someone should have invented the MP3 player instead, or popularized it instead of Apple.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they tried to do it. Now they're stuck. They can't, they have to double down. They can't back out.
Yeah. It's a funny thing. So often missed when people are afraid of big businesses. The big businesses are constantly churning because they're not very good at what they do. And they're constantly dying off, just technically getting often bought out by other big businesses, and the name preserved, but, essentially dying off with remarkable rapidity. But anyhow, so I think that sort of nicely takes the conversation, all the way from one end to the other of writing. And since this has been, do I have time? I don't have a time, but several hours now. I think it seems like a pretty good place to stop. So thank you very much. It's been a delightful conversation.
You're welcome, Christopher. Thank you for having me on.
All right. And to anyone listening, may you hit everything you aim at. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Hi. Welcome. Today I'm talking with Brian Niemeier. I assume you're best known as the author of the Soul Cycle series?
That would probably be correct, yes.
Although also fairly big now, very recently is, and I haven't gotten enough sleep, so the name of it is escaping me, but you have a short story in a collection of short stories that just came out, don't you?
Yes, I do. The anthology is called Forbidden Thoughts. It has several authors in it that would be known to those who followed the sad and rabid puppies saga over the Hugos for the last couple of years, including Larry Correia, Brad Torgerson, Sarah Hoyt, and Vox Day, as well as John C. Wright and his lovely and talented wife, and my editor, Aljaji Lamplighter Wright. My story is called Elegy for the Locust, and you're correct that like I would still be best known as the author of the Soul Cycle because that story ties into the Soul Cycle. But
So,
the reason, well, I was going to say the reason that Forbidden Thoughts might eclipse my fame as the author of the Soul Cycle series is an introduction by Milo Yiannopoulos.
yeah, the both the perils and the benefits of being near bright stars, I suppose.
You
I
got
mean
it.
stars in the I was using that in the astronomical sense. But you know, as think of the metaphor, that if you're near a bright star, it's very easy to locate, and consequently, you can be found by it. Um, but star also means more commonly other things. Anyway, so could you give just a very brief? It's horror is the genre. Can you give a brief description of the Soul Cycle series?
Certainly, and horror is only one genre box that you could put the series into. I adhere to Larry Correia's advice of just write what you like and then let Amazon and the other bookstores worry about how to pigeonhole it. So it's really the epitome of genre bashing, or as it's been called, the kitchen sink books, kitchen sink book. I believe Jeff Rowe Johnson from Castle House blog called it that. So there are sci-fi elements, there are fantasy elements, there are urban fantasy elements, and yes, of course, in every book there is a horror element, but it's a different kind of horror in each book, really.
Hmm. Interesting. Now, as I understand it, your background actually, you had studied theology at a Franciscan university.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That's correct. Franciscan University of Steubenville.
Hmm. So how did you end up? Because at the moment, you're actually supporting yourself professionally by your writing. Is that correct?
It is correct, which takes a lot of brand building, a lot of marketing, and a lot of ramen.
So how did you end up? So I assume writing has been a passion of yours for a long time. How did you end up making that transition? And at what point did it seem realistic to actually go for it?
I ended up not actually having a choice. I have to do this. And much like the star metaphor, there are two senses in which that's true. One is because it turns out I do have a God given talent for the written word. I feel bad if I don't write. It's just something I'm impelled and inspired to do. So, again, don't want to hide my light under a bushel basket. I want to use the gifts that God gave me to glorify Him and to entertain others. On a very pragmatic level, I tried working in the private sector and they wouldn't have me, so I have to do this now.
It's funny. Actually, it's something. Talking to people, encountered a few, people saying, well, how can I figure out what's the work that God's given me to do? And of course, one answer is, well, look at the work that you've been handed. That may well be it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So there's when people ask something of you, well, maybe giving it to them is the work you've been given to do. And it does seem, I've followed your blog for a bit now, a month or two, I think. And it does seem you take the idea of entertaining your fans very seriously.
Oh, deadly seriously, because it's a matter of my livelihood. It is a matter of life and death. And as an artist, I see it as my duty to serve truth. And that means serving my patrons in charity. So I'm not going to lie to them. I'm not going to abuse them. I'm not going to pull a fast one on them. They're my bosses. I'm beholden to them.
Now it was. I don't know if you happen to catch the interview I did with Russell Newquist, but a topic that came up in our conversation was that actually of patronage. It's something I find very interesting about the modern era is we're kind of returning to an era of patronage. Distributed patronage made possible by technology, but nonetheless, I think you can see it in a lot of different places. That like Patreon being one, and somewhat obviously named, but that in the medieval period, especially, you had very much a system of patronage. And it served a very useful role. So we had spoken about this, that you need not just talent to make good art, but also good taste. And that those two skills being united in one person are less common than just one of them. And so in the patronage system, you can take somebody who's got the talent and select for that, and then the patron, who's very often just a very ordinary average person, would impose something of the a common sort of taste onto the artist. And so do you see that? I'm okay. In what sense do you see your fans in that sort of patron sense, even though you are still using the sort of conventional model of making it first and then people buy it afterwards? And what do you think of the patron? To the degree that we're going for a modern patronage system, and what do you think of patronage systems?
Well, I'll go ahead and defer to a much more prominent and frankly better writer than I, Neil Stevenson. And he once said in an interview that there are two kinds of artists. There are what he called Beowulf artists, and then I believe what he called Da Vinci artists. So there are those who do have patrons to please, and like I said, do tend to have others' tastes imposed on them, sort of making it work for hire. And then there are those who say, well, I'm just going to tell a story to tell a story. And I don't necessarily have any more strictures placed on me than the tradition I'm working in, but I might not make a living at it, because we don't know if Homer made a living from reciting his epic poetry or the unknown authors of Beowulf. And what he was speaking about more in terms of patronage was those literary writers who might have a day job as an English professor or teaching a Master of Fine Arts program, and then will write a book or two a year to get published through the university press, or a short story in a very exclusive literary journal. He illustrated this point with a story about how he was at a major convention, like either Worldcon or Gen Con, somewhere of the sort. And he fell into speaking with a nice young lady who also identified herself as a writer. And they started talking. It was clear that she didn't know who he was. And he didn't want to embarrass her, so he just, he humored her. Until finally she asked him, okay, so what do you do for a living? And he said, oh, I'm a writer. So she said, oh, okay, well, I mean, like, what is your full-time job? He said, well, I'm a writer. So she's like, oh, well, then what? Do you have like an endowment or a grant or something? Or are you like a tenured chair somewhere? And he's like, no, I'm a writer. And then her face fell. Her eyes just widened like a deer in headlights. And he thought, oh no, she's thinking, he's one of them. He's one of those lowbrows who writes popular fiction. So I think that might be the older sense of patronage that might give it a bad name. What I'm more think of it as is, like you said, people with Patreon accounts, or another concept that my friend Jeff Dunton, another fantastic author, talks about is micro celebrity, where nowadays, thanks to innovations like Kindle Direct Publishing and Patreon and blogs with tip jars, you don't really need 6 million fans. You just need 1,000. And if you can cultivate a tribe of 1,000 diehard fans who will show up every time to buy your wares, well, if you release $100 worth of merchandise a year, you're making $100,000 a year. And that seems to be more the future of where at least publishing is going. Mm. Because the big 5 publishers are just circling the drain. They're dying. Indie is capturing more and more of their market share. And as Vox Day has said, that's not a zero-sum game. That's a negative-sum game for them, for the big publishers, because every Kindle Unlimited download, every sale to an indie author like me on Amazon isn't one sale that the big 5 lose. It's 2, because of the price differential and differences in distribution.
Interesting point. There's a similar phenomenon going on, I think, enabled by technology. You see it in movies, you see it in television. Um, Especially I think in television, you see the progression in the 1950s. There were, depending on where you were and stuff, 2, 3, 4 channels, and that kept up. I think largely through, my memory's failing me slightly, I think the 70s roughly.
Mhm.
You start getting more channels. By the 80s you have 20, 30 channels in bigger metropolitan areas, less in smaller, still the age of broadcast, and then cable comes on, and you have even more these days. I haven't had television service in something like 15 years now, but I'm told that there are 500, 600 channels um, in a basic cable um, thing. But at the same time, so of course, each one gets a much smaller pie. And it's very interesting. Are you familiar with what the most watched television episode ever is? Of scripted television, that is.
Oh my
Scripted.
goodness, trivia time. Okay, let me try to guess here because I was going to say one of the Super Bowls, but then you mentioned scripted.
Yeah, I mean, it's
So
scripted, dramatic, although comedy, etc., all counts. But
okay, I'm like you. I haven't subscribed to television in years, but there are two I'm thinking of, which is either the last episode of MASH or the last episode of I Love Lucy. I'm gonna say the last episode of I Love Lucy.
actually, it's the last episode of MASH.
Oh darn! I should second guess myself.
Yeah, there weren't enough people watching TV in the end.
Yeah.
At I Love Lucy. Yeah, the final episode of MASH garnered 140 million people watching it.
Mm.
The second most watched, it's been a little while since I looked this up. The second most watched was something like, I think, 80 million, or possibly less. And then I looked it up as of, I think I was looking this up last year. And so I think last year, the most watched episode in the last 10 years of scripted television was The Big Bang Show, one of the season finales, with, I think it was 20 million viewers. And so there's something, or no, I'm sorry, it was like 14 million viewers, I think. It's somewhere in that range. There's something like between 2000 and 2016, no single episode of television had garnered more than 25 million viewers. I think it might have been not even 20 million viewers. And so if you compare that to something like MASH in, I think that'd be the late 70s, that it finished.
I think it was the early 80s. Tom Simon did a whole series of essays on MASH a little while ago.
Mm. Okay, so the early 80s, right about that time, incredibly popular, not that much. And so you had that phenomenon where there was a very shared popular culture. But again, now with several hundred channels, and these days they're competing with all sorts of YouTube shows. They're relatively popular, YouTube shows that can get several million views per episode. Some of the bigger ones, and a bunch of people do them. But again, there's so much competition that I think technology is pushing it in that direction where, with a bit of looking, you can find things that really suit your personality, that really suit your tastes in a way that was much harder when distribution wasn't nearly so good. And so the upshot, when you can get that, we've gotten something that really, really suits your tastes 5 or 6 or 7 times so far, you start, I think, becoming a lot more motivated to find that and a lot more discriminating when things don't. So I think there's an interesting push in terms of where our culture is shifting in that very small sort of direction where we're all fans of fairly specific things.
Oh, absolutely. And there's also the element of not just one generation gap, but multiples. Because the baby boomers are really the last generation to have their entertainment preferences revolve around and set by television. If you look at who is subscribing to television and who's not, millennials aren't. They're cutting the cable more and more frequently. I think only a third of them have television, at least in the traditional sense of subscribing to cable. I mean, they get it through like Hulu or Netflix or Amazon Prime, other like a collection of services. And the same goes for the nightly news. Really, only even older generations still watch or even trust the 3 major network news outlets.
Yeah, so, there's a news source I can't wait for it to die. The amount of damage that television news has done to society I think would be difficult even to estimate. Well, it is in part the nature of constant news cycles, where you need to fill things, and consequently there becomes always that temptation to manufacture news, and hence things like the big